Hey there and welcome back. If you are already lying down, with the lamp turned low and the day finally letting go of its hold on you, then you have arrived at the right hour. Tonight is an evening for one long life, told from the beginning, and told without hurry. It is an evening for anyone who has ever held a household together while the world outside was coming apart, and for anyone who has ever done something enormous without once being asked whether they wanted to. I would like to take you to a river in Virginia, and then to a plantation on that river, and then to a war, and then to two cities that were briefly the capital of a brand new country, and at last to a bare room on the third floor of a house above the Potomac. You do not have to follow the dates. You do not have to hold anything in your mind. Let the story come to you the way a room comes to you when someone else is tending the fire. And if you drift away from me before the end, that is exactly what this is for. But I will tell you where we are going, so that some part of you is listening for it. In the last spring of her life, in that bare third-floor room, an old woman sat with a bundle of paper on her knees and fed nearly 40 years of her husband's letters into a fire, one by one, until almost nothing remained. Two survived. Only two out of all of it. Before this evening is finished, you will know exactly why she did that, and you may find, as I did, that you cannot blame her for a moment of it. Before we go back, one thing. If these evenings are something you would like to find again, you are welcome to subscribe, and then they will simply arrive, without you having to look for them. I would love to know where you are listening from tonight, and what the hour is where you are, because this life we are about to walk through was lived by a woman who wrote letters constantly, to sisters and nieces and friends scattered across a country that was still learning its own shape, and who wanted to know exactly where everybody was and how they were keeping. Leave it in the comments below. I love looking through them, and I answer more of them than you might think. Picture this: a river in the tidewater country of Virginia, wide and brown and slow-moving between low banks, in the summer of 1731. The Pamunkey, it bends and doubles back on itself so extravagantly that a boat can travel 3 miles of water to gain 1 mile of distance. On either side, the land is flat and fertile and dense with chestnut and oak, and where the trees have been cleared, the tobacco stands in ordered rows, broad-leaved, waist-high, the most valuable plant in the British Empire. It is hot. It is the kind of heat that presses on the chest, that makes the air above the fields shimmer, that brings the mosquitoes up off the water at dusk in clouds. There is a 2-story frame house set back from the bank, plain and well built, with fruit trees around it and chestnuts behind. It is called Chestnut Grove. It belongs to a man named John Dandridge, who came out from England as a young man of about 25, who married a Virginia-born woman named Frances Jones, and who has made himself into something respectable in the county: a planter with 500 acres, a clerk of the county court, a vestryman of the parish church. He is not one of the mighty, in the ranked and stratified world of colonial Virginia, where a handful of families own most of the good river land and sit on the governor's council and marry only one another. John Dandridge is on the third rung of a very tall ladder, holding on securely, looking up. On the 2nd day of June, in that house, his wife delivers a daughter. They call her Martha. She is the first of 8 children, and from the beginning she is the eldest, which in a house like this one is not a position of privilege, but a position of employment. Within a few years she will be carrying an infant on her hip while another clings to her skirts. Within 10 years she will know how to settle a fever, how to salt a ham, how to reckon what the household will need to survive a winter, and how to speak to a slave in a way that gets the work done, without anybody having to raise a voice. Her family call her Patsy. It is the ordinary pet form of Martha in Virginia at that date, and the name will come round again in her life in a way she cannot imagine. There are things that we know about this childhood and things that we do not. We know she was taught her letters at a time when a great many Virginia girls were not, and that she could write, and did, and went on writing to the end. Her spelling is her own, and it never improved, and she did not think it needed to. We know she was taught to figure, to add a column, to keep a household account, and that this turned out to matter enormously. We know she learned to ride, and rode well, and kept riding into old age. We know she played the spinet, or at least owned one and had lessons, and that dancing was not a frivolity in that society, but a serious social technology, a language in which alliances were spoken, And we know that Chestnut Grove was worked by about 20 enslaved people, and that Martha Dandridge grew up in the middle of them, was carried by them as a baby, was fed by them, and learned before she could form a full sentence that there were people in the house whose entire existence was arranged around her comfort. I am not going to leave that fact behind at the edge of the evening. It sits in the middle of this life. It will be in the room in every chapter, sometimes in the foreground, most of the time silently holding the whole structure up. And I will tell you plainly, as we go, who those people were and what happened to them. The rhythm of that girlhood was set by three places: the house, the church, and the courthouse. As Peter's parish church stood a few miles off, a brick building with a squat tower, and the Dandridges went to it every Sunday that the roads allowed. Church in colonial Virginia was not only devotion, it was the weekly assembly of the neighborhood. Families arrived on horseback and in chairs, and stood about in the churchyard beforehand hearing the news. And afterwards a planter might invite a dozen people home to dinner on the strength of a conversation held between the gravestones. Marriages were arranged there, debts were settled there. A girl of 12, standing beside her mother in her best gown, was being shown to the county. The courthouse at New Kent was the other pole. Once a month, on court day, the whole district came in, planters with suits to file, farmers with debts to swear, boys to see the horse racing, peddlers, tavern keepers doing the trade of the year in a single afternoon. Her father was the clerk of that court. He sat at the table below the justices and wrote it all down, and the county's business went through his hands, and everybody in it knew him. That is where the Dandridge standing came from. Not land, of which they had a moderate amount. Ink, and the house itself. 2 stories, wooden, painted, with a passage running through the middle from the front door to the back, so that on an August afternoon a breath of air might move along it. Fruit trees, chestnuts. A kitchen in a separate building, because a kitchen fire in an 18th century frame house was the difference between dinner and ashes. A dairy, a smokehouse, a stable, and beyond them the quarters, and beyond those the fields, and beyond those the river. 8 children in that house, and Martha the eldest of them. John, Anna Maria, William, Bartholomew, Francis, Elizabeth, Mary. Anna Maria Nancy, in the family, was the sister she loved best in the world and wrote to for 30 years. She would outlive most of them. What she was taught was practical, and it was not nothing. She learned her letters and her figures from her father, or from a hired tutor, or from both. The point is that a girl on a middling Virginia plantation in the 1730s emerged able to write a legible hand and keep an account, and a great many did not. Her spelling was phonetic and stayed that way, and nobody in her world thought worse of her for it, since her husband's own spelling was erratic and Jefferson's was not much better. What she never had was the education that a gentleman's son might get. No Latin, no history, no philosophy. She never once, in the whole of her long life, pretended otherwise, and I find that rather admirable in a woman who ended by presiding over the conversation of a nation. She learned to ride in a country where a woman who could not ride was a woman who could not leave the house. She learned to dance, and the dancing master was as necessary to a Virginia childhood as the parson. She was taught to play the spinet, badly, and to sing, and to sew exquisitely, which she did until the last months of her life. And she was taught, without anybody saying so aloud, how to run the enterprise. The eldest daughter of 8 is an apprentice housekeeper by the age of 10. She learns the still room and the linen press. She learns how much meal a household eats in a week, and what a hogshead of tobacco is worth in London, and how to tell an overseer he has done wrong without raising her voice, and how to be pleasant to a guest she cannot bear for 4 consecutive days. There is one more thing in that family that the record whispers rather than states. John Dandridge fathered at least 1 child outside his marriage. The historian who has looked most closely at this family believes that Martha grew up with a half-sister born into slavery on that plantation, a girl named Anne Dandridge, and that the whole household knew it, and none of them wrote it down. The evidence is not conclusive. It is not implausible either. It was the ordinary arithmetic of the tidewater, and it is the sort of thing that a family's papers are very careful never to contain. What was it like, then, to be this girl? Small, she never grew past 5 feet, and would spend her adulthood standing a full head and shoulders beneath the man everybody now remembers. Dark-haired, by every description we have, from people who had no particular reason to flatter her, she was pleasant to look at and much more pleasant to talk to. She had the gift, rare in any century, of making the person in front of her feel that they were the reason she had come into the room. In a society organized around visits, where a neighbor might arrive at noon with 3 relatives and stay 4 days, where hospitality was a duty rather than a courtesy, this was not charm as decoration. It was competence. It was the skill on which a planter's household ran, and the household ran on a calendar that had nothing to do with clocks. In the spring, the seed beds. In early summer, the transplanting, the endless topping and suckering of the tobacco. In August and September, the cutting and the hanging of the leaf in the barns to cure, and the smell of that curing over everything for weeks. In autumn, the stripping and the prizing of the leaf into hogsheads. Those enormous barrels, each one weighing near 1,000 pounds, rolled down to the landing on the river. In November and December, the killing of the hogs, and the smokehouse working day and night. In January and February, the mending, the spinning, the accounts, then the seedbeds again, round and round. A girl growing up inside that calendar absorbs it the way she absorbs her own heartbeat. 40 years later, in a rented house in a strange northern city, with the entire correspondence of a new republic passing through her hall, she would still be thinking about whether the hams at home had been properly cured, and writing to ask. She was expected to marry, and to marry well. That was the one great transaction of her life, and everybody understood it. In the world she was born into, a woman had almost no other route to security. She could not vote, could not sit on a jury, could not sue in her own name once she was married, could not own property separately from her husband, except by careful legal arrangement. What she could do was choose once when she was very young, and then live inside that choice. The Dandridges hoped for a solid match with a neighbouring family of about their own standing. What Martha did instead, at 18, was reach 2 full rungs up the ladder and take hold. 4 miles down the Pamunkey from Chestnut Grove, there stood a house that had been given, at some point in the previous century, a name that history would find almost unbearably funny. It was called the White House. It was the seat of the Custis family, and in 1749 its heir was a bachelor of 38 named Daniel Parker Custis, a man of enormous fortune and no visible enemies, who had never married for one reason only. His father would not let him. That father was John Custis IV of Williamsburg, and he was, by the collected testimony of everybody who ever met him, one of the most disagreeable men in the colony. He had endured a catastrophically unhappy marriage. The stories about the Custis marriage were still being repeated a century later, and involved a carriage driven deliberately into the York River, and he had spent his widowerhood refining a talent for obstruction. Twice his son had wished to marry. Twice the old man had destroyed the match, with threats to disinherit, with lawyers, with insult. Daniel, mild and dutiful, and by now approaching middle age, had submitted both times. And when word reached Williamsburg that his son had formed an attachment to a Dandridge girl from up the river, a clerk's daughter, 500 acres, no fortune to speak of, John Custis produced the reaction that everyone had expected. He was beneath them. There would be no marriage. He would leave the entire Custis estate elsewhere. He would sooner throw the silver into the river. Here is the first thing that Martha Dandridge did, and it should tell you everything about the woman who is going to walk through the rest of this evening. She went to Williamsburg. She went, at 18, to the home of a wealthy, bitter, litigious old man who had publicly declared that she was not good enough for his family, and she asked to see him, and she sat down with him. What was said between them, nobody wrote down. What we have is the result. The old man emerged from that interview a convert. He instructed his lawyer to put it on record that he was now entirely willing, that he thought better of the young woman than of any other, that the marriage might proceed. Whatever she had, the steadiness, the plain good sense, the refusal to be either humiliated or shrill, it had gone through that armour like water through sand. He signed a will in his son's favour, and that November he died. Daniel Parker Custis, at 38, inherited nearly 18,000 acres of prime tidewater land spread across 6 counties, a house in Williamsburg, close to 200 more human beings held in bondage, and enough cash and English treasury notes to make him one of the 2 or 3 richest men in Virginia. On the 15th of May, in 1750, he married Martha Dandridge at Chestnut Grove. She was 18, he was 38. There is not a shred of evidence that she was unhappy about any part of it, and a good deal of evidence that the 7 years which followed were the easiest of her whole existence. Come with me down the river, then, to the house she moved into as a bride. The White House stood on a rise above the Pamunkey, looking out over its own fields. It was not a palace. Virginia in the middle of the 18th century had almost no palaces, and the ones it had were built later. What it was instead was a well-proportioned brick and frame dwelling at the center of an operation, and the operation was what mattered. 5 plantations, 18,000 acres, fields of tobacco, and beyond them corn and wheat, and beyond those the marsh and the woods, barns, curing houses, a smithy, a cooperage where the hogsheads were made, stables, a dairy, a kitchen standing apart from the dwelling so that the heat and the risk of fire stayed outside, a landing on the water where a shallow draught vessel could come up on the tide, and in the quarters, out of sight of the windows but never out of earshot, the several hundred people without whom none of it turned. Martha Custis, at 19, became the mistress of all of it, and she was good at it immediately. I want to show you what that actually meant, because the phrase mistress of a plantation has been so thoroughly upholstered by other people's storytelling that the real work has gone missing underneath. She did not merely receive guests in a pretty gown. She ran a manufactory. The house itself required a dozen enslaved workers under her direction, a cook, a butler, a nurse for the children, seamstresses, washerwomen, a maid for her own person. She assigned their work, and she judged it. The dairy had to produce butter, and the butter had to be right, or it would not keep. Meat had to be salted and smoked in the autumn to feed several hundred people until the following autumn, and if the salting was botched, the household ate rotten pork, or did not eat. Candles were made there. Soap was made there. Cloth was woven, cut, sewn, and mended under that roof. Medicines were compounded in the still room, and when a person on the plantation fell ill, it was the mistress who was called, and who came with her chest of remedies, and who sat up. And there was the correspondence trade, which is the part I find most revealing. Virginia planters did not sell their tobacco locally. They shipped it to London on consignment to a merchant house that sold it for them, deducted its commission, and held the proceeds as a credit against which the planter then ordered goods. Every autumn a Virginia family sat down and wrote out an invoice, a long, itemized list of everything they wished the merchant to buy, and shipped them across 4,000 miles of ocean, to arrive the following summer. Nails, hose, window glass, bolts of Irish linen, loaf sugar, books, a saddle, shoes for every person in the household, sized by a paper tracing of the foot. And for the mistress, gowns, ribbons, silver, tea equipage, china. Those invoices survive. You can look at what Martha Custis ordered, and the woman comes up off the page at you. She has an exact eye. She wants the damask for the dining chairs to be a particular blue, and she says so. She wants a tea service of Chinese export porcelain. She wants sterling flatware engraved with the Custis arms. She wants her clothes in the current London fashion, and she is prepared to be extremely specific about it. And when the merchant sends her something second-rate, she says that too. Daniel ordered her a riding chair, a light one-person carriage, and had it lined with blue English cloth for her comfort. The two of them were spending like people who could not conceive of an end to the money, which is to say, like every Virginia planter of that generation, most of whom died in debt to the very merchants who supplied them. She kept the ledgers. That habit, formed at 20 in a house on the Pamunkey, would one day be exercised in a stone farmhouse in Pennsylvania, with an army starving outside the door. And the visits. Always the visits. The White House lay a day's ride from Williamsburg, the colonial capital, and when the assembly sat, or the courts, or the racing season came, the whole gentry of the Tidewater was in motion. People arrived. They stayed. Martha Custis kept a table at which 12 or 15 might sit down without notice, presided over balls, was presented to the governor, and became, in the space of a very few years, one of the 24 women whose approval settled a family's standing in the colony. She had climbed 2 rungs and made it look like nothing at all. Then the children came, and with them the other half of this life, the half that is nearly unbearable to walk through. Her first was a son, born in November of 1751, when she was 20. They named him Daniel Parker Custis for his father. There was a peculiar and rather grim condition attached to the family fortune. An ancestor had stipulated in his will that only descendants carrying the name Park could inherit, and so every one of Martha's children by this marriage would bear it, whether they wanted it or not. In April of 1753 came a daughter, Frances Parker Custis. In 1754, a second son, John, whom everybody called Jackie from the day he could answer to it. And in 1756, a second daughter, Martha, called Patsy, after her mother. 4 children in 5 years. In the colonial tidewater that was ordinary, and so was what happened next. The Virginia lowlands were a beautiful and murderous place to be a child. The water was bad. The mosquitoes carried malaria as reliably as the tide came in. Diphtheria moved through the parishes in waves, so did dysentery, whooping cough, the bloody flux, and the smallpox that would arrive in a shipload of new goods and empty a county. Somewhere around 40 in every 100 children born into that landscape did not live to see 20. Everybody knew it. Everybody had buried somebody. The parish registers are full of the small entries, and the grave plots of the great families are full of the small stones, and this did not make the fact of it any easier to survive. It only meant that nobody was permitted to be surprised. In 1754, little Daniel died. He was not yet 3. The likeliest cause is malaria. In the spring of 1757, Frances died, aged 4. I want to pause there because the record moves past those 2 deaths in a line, and I do not think we should. Martha Custis was 25 and had buried 2 of her 4 children within 3 years. She had a boy of 3 and a girl of 1 still living. The mourning practice of her class and time was formal. The black clothing, the closed shutters, the ring made with a lock of the dead child's hair, set under glass, worn on the finger for the rest of her life. She wore such rings. She kept all her days the habit of writing about children with a raw anxiety that startles anyone who comes to her letters expecting 18th century composure. Every fever in a grandchild, 60 years later, would go through her like a spike. She was not a stoic. She was a woman who had learned early that the world could take a child out of a bed in an afternoon, and she never once forgot it, and she never once talked about it more than she had to. And then, in July of that same summer, when Frances had lain in her grave barely 4 months, her husband fell ill. It began on the 4th day of the month. Daniel and his young son were both taken sick together. The boy, Jackie, recovered. Daniel did not. The physicians came and prescribed what physicians prescribed in 1757, and from the surviving apothecary bills we can guess reasonably well what was wrong with him. Something virulent in the throat, quinsy or diphtheria, or a streptococcal fever, one of those infections that a modern pharmacy would end in a week, and that killed a healthy man of 45 in 4 days. On the 8th of July, at the White House on the Pamunkey, Daniel Parker Custis died. He left no will. Whether he had put it off, or believed himself immortal, or simply thought there was time, nobody knows. And the effect of that single omission on the history of the United States is difficult to overstate, because a man who dies intestate in colonial Virginia does not get to decide anything, and English common law decides for him. Here is what the law did. 1/3 of Daniel's personal property, the cash, the plate, the stock, the human beings held as chattel, passed outright and absolutely to his widow. The other 2/3 passed to the surviving children, Jackie and Patsy, to be held in trust until they came of age. And of the land and of the enslaved people attached to the land, the widow received what was called her dower. The use of 1/3 of it for the whole of her natural life, the income from it, the produce of it, but not the ownership. On her death, that dower third would revert to the Custis estate and pass to the Custis heirs. It was hers to use and never hers to give away. Remember that. It is the hinge on which a great deal of what follows will turn, including the last decision of her life. And she was, at 26, quite possibly the wealthiest widow in the colony of Virginia, some 17,500 acres, close to 300 enslaved men, women and children, personal property and cash valued at something like £40,000 sterling, which is a figure that means nothing until you set it beside a labourer's annual wage of perhaps £15, and then it means everything. She was also the sole executrix of an unwilled estate riddled with lawsuits, because the Parkey inheritance had come tangled in litigation reaching back into the previous century and across the Atlantic, and those suits were now hers to fight. She did not hand it to a male relative. She could have. Custom half expected it. Instead, she took hold of the whole apparatus herself and ran it. Consider what that meant in practice. She wrote to the London merchants, to Robert Carey and Company, to John Hanbury in her own hand, in her own name, and she was not deferential. She told them the tobacco they had sold on her account had fetched too little, and that she expected better next season. She ordered her mourning clothes from London and specified the fabric. She instructed her overseers on 5 plantations. She sued and was sued, appointed attorneys in England, examined accounts, and pursued the Parkey claims. She made decisions about the crops of an entire growing year, and about the buying and the selling and the movement of people whose lives were, in the pitiless legal fiction of that world, entries in her inventory. Let me show you her desk in that first year of widowhood, because it is the least romantic and most revealing room in this whole story. There is the inventory. When a Virginian died intestate, everything he owned had to be appraised and written down, item by item, by neighbours appointed for the purpose, the silver by weight, the livestock by head, the furniture room by room, and the men, women and children by name and age and value. That document ran on for pages. She had to check it. There is the tobacco. 5 plantations, each with an overseer, each producing a crop of variable quality, all of it to be inspected, prized into hogsheads, marked with the estate's brand, rolled to the landing and shipped. Whether it fetched a good price in London depended on the season, the war, the merchant, and the reputation of the mark. She wrote to the merchants about all of it. She changed factors when one disappointed her. There is the litigation. The Custis fortune had come down from a man named Daniel Parkey, an ancestor of her husband's, who had been a soldier, a governor of the Leeward Islands, and a scoundrel of some magnificence, and who had been torn apart by a mob in Antigua, and had left behind a will so provoking that his family was still at law over it half a century later. Claims against that estate were still live in 1757. There was a suit hanging over the Custis lands that could, if it went the wrong way, have swallowed a very large portion of them. She retained counsel in Williamsburg. She corresponded with attorneys in England. She kept that suit alive and at bay, and it was not settled in her lifetime, and it followed her second husband into his old age. And there is the townhouse in Williamsburg, hers now, standing ready for the seasons when the capital filled up, and the whole gentry of the Tidewater came into it. Now hold 2 facts together. The first is that in that year she was, in a purely legal sense, freer than she would ever be again. The second is that she was 26, and a widow in a black gown, and every man of business she dealt with knew perfectly well that she could not vote, could not plead in her own person in a court of law without difficulty, and would in the ordinary way of things be expected to hand the whole thing over to a husband within 18 months. She got it in order first. Then she chose the husband. For roughly 18 months, Martha Dandridge Custis was one of the largest independent proprietors in British North America, answerable to nobody. It is the only stretch of her adult life in which that was true. A widow in the 18th century occupied the single square on the board, where a woman was legally a person. She could contract, hold property, sue, be sued, keep her own money, marry again, and every bit of it passed under her husband's hand at the church door. She knew that perfectly well, and she chose to marry again anyway within 2 years, and I do not think she was foolish or weak for it. She had 2 children under 5. She had a mountain of litigation and 100 overseers' quarrels, and no protector in a society organized entirely around male protection, and she was 26, which is very young to decide to be alone for the rest of her life. So the suitors came up the river. They came in force, and they were not modest men. Charles Carter of Cleve was among them, a member of the House of Burgesses, son of the man they had called King Carter, who had died possessed of 300,000 acres and 1,000 human beings, and a nickname that tells you everything. To marry a Carter was to marry the colony itself. He was a widower with children, considerably older than she was, and he was in earnest, and by any calculation that a Virginia family would have made on paper, he was the correct answer. Others came whose names have not stayed. The parlour of the White House in the spring of 1758 must have been an interesting room to sit in, with the widow in her mourning silks pouring tea for a succession of gentlemen who had each calculated, to the acre, exactly what she was worth. And in the middle of March, a colonel of the Virginia regiment turned his horse off the road to the ferry and rode up the lane. His name was George Washington. He was 26, 6 feet 2 or 3 in a colony where 6 feet was a rarity, a superb horseman, physically imposing in a way that everybody remarked upon and nobody could quite describe. He had come to public notice 4 years earlier by starting, more or less single-handedly and entirely by accident, a skirmish in the Ohio country that had set light to a war between France and Britain across 3 continents. He had been beaten at Fort Necessity. He had survived Braddock's catastrophe on the Monongahela, riding through the whole route with bullets through his coat, and had come out of it with a reputation for personal courage that no defeat could dent. He commanded all Virginia's provincial forces. He was, in the currency of that place and that year, a hero. He was also, by the standard that mattered in the White House parlour, a poor man. Let me be precise about that, because it is the engine of everything. Washington had been born into the second tier of Virginia gentry, and as a third son of a second marriage, he had inherited very little. His education stopped at about 15. He had no Latin, no Greek, no university, and he was conscious of the gap for the rest of his life. He had made himself into a land surveyor as a boy and taught himself the ground. The estate on the Potomac, called Mount Vernon, which he loved, was not his. It had belonged to his adored elder half-brother Lawrence, and after Lawrence died, Washington was renting it from his widow. He held land warrants in the West of uncertain value. He was in debt for his uniforms and his horses. He wanted more than anything in the world to be one of the first men of Virginia, and he was not, and he knew exactly what the shortfall was, and he knew that there was precisely one route across it available to a man of his position. That is the transaction. It is right there on the surface, and anybody who tells you otherwise is selling a marble statue. He needed a fortune. She had one. Now let me tell you what is also true, in the same breath, without contradiction. The visit was in March, and by his own financial notebook he was there twice inside 3 weeks, and he was in a hurry both times. He left tips for the White House servants. He recorded the amounts, being a man constitutionally capable of not recording an amount, and rode away and came straight back. By June the thing was settled. He wrote to a friend that autumn about the animating prospect of possessing Mrs. Custis, which is the language of an 18th century gentleman and not of a lover, and which nonetheless has an unmistakable heat in it. He ordered a suit of superfine blue broadcloth from London and a ring. He resigned his commission at the end of the year, and what she saw, sitting across the tea table from a very tall young man with poor teeth and a barely concealed hunger to rise, was something no fortune could have supplied. He was industrious. He was honest to the point of inconvenience. He was famous for keeping his head when other men lost theirs. He was 26, as she was, and he had the physical vitality of a man who had ridden through wildernesses, which cannot have counted for nothing after 7 years with a gentle husband 2 decades her senior. And he liked children, plainly and without performance, which mattered more to her than the entire remainder of the list. She could have had Carter and the King Carter connection. She chose the surveyor. Everything the United States would later become rests, in a way that is faintly absurd to contemplate, on the judgment of a widow of 26 about a young man's character over a cup of tea in a room above the Pamunkey. They were married on the 6th day of January in 1759 at the White House, in the room where she had received all those hopeful gentlemen. It was 12th night, the last of the Christmas festival, which was the favourite season for a Virginia wedding, and she was married on it, and she would keep the anniversary of that day with more attachment than she kept her own birthday for the next 40 years. Imagine the bride. She wore a gown of deep yellow silk brocade with silver lace at the bodice, and purple satin shoes with silver buckles, and pearls in her hair. Pieces of that gown survive. The shoes survive. She was 27. Beside her stood a man in the blue and scarlet of a Virginia colonel, or perhaps in the new civilian suit he had ordered from London. The accounts of the day contradict one another, and we shall never settle it. And he was more than a foot taller than she was. And there is a family story, passed down by her granddaughter, that when she wanted his attention in later years, she would take hold of his collar and pull his face down to hers. The Reverend David Mossam spoke the service. There were fires in every room. There was a supper. Outside, the January mud of the tidewater. Inside, candles and syllabub and the fiddles going. They did not leave at once. There was a season in Williamsburg first, because the bridegroom had been elected to the House of Burgesses and had to take his seat. So the new Mrs. Washington kept house at 6 Chimneys, the Custis town residence on Francis Street, through the public times the weeks when the Assembly sat, and the General Court, and the whole colony came into the capital. Williamsburg was a village of 1,000 people that swelled to several thousand twice a year. The Duke of Gloucester Street ran a mile from the college at one end to the Capitol at the other, with the Governor's Palace on its green at the middle. There were taverns, and a printing office, and a playhouse, and the horse races on the outskirts, and a coffee house where the Burgesses argued. You went to the palace and was received. She sat in the gallery of the Capitol, perhaps, and watched a very tall new member get to his feet to be thanked by the House for his services on the frontier, and be so entirely unable to speak that the speaker told him to sit down, since his modesty equalled his valour, and both were beyond the power of any language. His family told that story for 50 years afterwards, and I cannot prove a word of it, and I would rather it were true than not. Then, in the first week of April, the whole household went north. It was a journey of about a week, and I would like you to travel it with me, because at the end of it is the place that both of them would spend the rest of their lives trying to get back to. Picture the road. Not a road in truth, but a track of packed clay, rutted by wagon wheels and softened by the spring rains, running up from the tidewater through pine and scrub, crossing creeks at fords where the coach axles went under water. There is the coach itself, and behind it a train of wagons and outriders, and among them Jackie Custis, aged 4, and Patsy Custis, aged 2, and their nurses, and a dozen enslaved men and women from the White House who have been told they are going and who have said goodbye to everybody they know. Nobody asked whether they wanted to. That is what the word means. 12 people are moved, as the furniture is moved, 90 miles north, and the record of it is a line in a ledger. And at the end of the ride, on the last afternoon, the ground begins to rise. The country changes. Instead of the flat marshy tidewater, there are rolling hills, and above the widest reach of the Potomac, on a bluff 120 feet above the water, stands a modest 1.5-story farmhouse in a mess of scaffolding, because Washington has been rebuilding it, hastily, in the months of his engagement, to make it fit for her. It was not the mansion you may have in your head. That came later, in stages, over 30 years. In April of 1759, Mount Vernon was a plain house of 8 rooms, freshly raised to a full story and a half, with the plaster still drying and the workmen still on the site, standing among 2,000 acres of thin upland soil that had already been half exhausted by tobacco. The view was extraordinary. The soil was ordinary. Washington had spent every shilling he could raise on the improvements, and he was still, on the day his wife arrived, the tenant of his brother's widow, and not the owner of the ground he stood on. Then the wagons came up the lane, and the Custis money came with them, and George Washington's life changed direction permanently. The Dower Third gave him the use of thousands of acres and the labor of some 85 enslaved people. As guardian of Jackie and Patsy, he had the administration of their 2/3 as well, which he handled with a scrupulousness that even his enemies never impugned. Within 2 years he bought Mount Vernon outright when Lawrence's widow died. Within a decade he was buying more land, more mills, more schooners, and abandoning tobacco altogether for wheat, because he had done the arithmetic, and tobacco was ruining every man who grew it. It is worth being exact about what the Custis money did, because the myth is that George Washington was born to Mount Vernon, and the truth is that he was rented into it and married his way out. Before the wedding, a leased farmhouse, 2,000 acres of tired soil, some Western warrants, and debts. After it, the command of one of the largest estates in Virginia, held partly in his wife's right and partly in trust for her children, and a reputation which he guarded ferociously for never touching a penny of what belonged to the two Custis heirs. Within 2 years, he bought Mount Vernon outright. Within 10, he had pushed its bounds out to 8,000 acres in 5 farms, and then he did the thing that separates him from almost every planter of his generation. He looked at tobacco, at the ruinous cycle of shipping a crop to London on credit, buying luxuries against its unknown price, and finding at the end of every season that the merchant's balance had moved against you and he got out. By the middle of the 1760s, Mount Vernon was growing wheat. He built a mill and ground his own flour and put his own brand on the barrels and shipped it to the West Indies. He built a schooner and worked the herring fishery. He wove his own cloth to stop buying it. He spun out of the consignment system altogether. And while the great Tidewater family slid deeper by the season into an indebtedness that would help push them into revolution, he was solvent, none of which would have been possible without a fortune to begin with, and the fortune walked up the lane in April of 1759, wearing a travelling cloak, with 2 small children and a wagon train of stolen lives behind her. He had married a fortune. He had also, and this is the part that the ledgers cannot show you, married the only person he would ever fully unbend with. There is not one sentence anywhere in the enormous surviving archive of that man, and there are 90,000 documents in which he speaks slightingly of her. There is not one credible account of a quarrel, in a life spent under the most relentless observation any American has ever endured, that is not nothing. They had no children together. It is likely, though not certain, that the smallpox he contracted in Barbados as a young man had left him unable to father any. Whatever the cause, it was a sorrow to both of them, and it made the 2 Custis children the entire centre of the household, and it made him, in the end, the father of a country instead. He never once spoke of it in writing. Neither did she. Now let us go through a year in that house, because for 16 years from the spring of 1759 to the spring of 1775, this is the whole of her existence, and it is the part of her life she was happiest in, and it is the part that almost nobody bothers to describe. She rose early. She was, by every account of everybody who lived with her, an early riser and a brisk one, out of bed before the sun and downstairs before the fires were properly drawing, and she spent an hour alone with her Bible in her chamber before she would speak to anybody. That hour was inviolable. She kept it for 60 years, then the day's business. The keys, an 18th century housekeeper carried them, and the keys were the sign of the office, and nobody else touched them. The storerooms unlocked, the day's provisions issued and weighed out. Flour, meal, salt, sugar, coffee, spirits. The kitchen given its orders. The dairy inspected. Then the spinning room, where wool and flax and cotton were carded and spun and woven into the coarse cloth in which most of the plantation was dressed. In one 12-month, the Mount Vernon spinners produced better than 800 yards of it. Every yard of it was under her eye. Then the sick. There was always somebody sick. A plantation of 200 people is a village without a doctor, and the mistress was the doctor, and Martha Washington's medical chest, and her recipes for tinctures and syrups and poultices went with her everywhere for 50 years. She sat up with dying people. She did it in the enslaved quarters as well as under her own roof, and I do not offer that as an absolution of anything. The smokehouse in November, and the hams. Her hams were famous. She cured them herself, with a method she had brought from the Pamunkey and would not release. And men wrote about those hams in their diaries as though describing a religious experience. The mending, the accounts, the letters. And then, at 3 in the afternoon, dinner, and after dinner, the visitors. I cannot make you understand the visitors without a number. In a single 12-month of the 1760s, Washington recorded that the household had sat down to dinner alone. Just the family? No guests, on precisely 2 occasions. 2 days in 365. Everybody else arrived. Neighbors, kin, planters passing to Alexandria, officers, merchants, clergymen, strangers with a letter of introduction from somebody in Williamsburg. They came for dinner. They stayed the night. They stayed a week. And the mistress of the house met them at the door and fed them and gave them beds and their horses stabled and their linen laundered and their children entertained. And she did it all with such unruffled and unhurried courtesy that not one of them in all the diaries and letters they left behind ever recorded her being anything other than delighted to see them. That is the life. Bells and keys and hams and strangers. She loved it. And underneath all of it, holding every hour of it up, were the people nobody asked. At Mount Vernon in those years, there were something over 100 enslaved men, women and children, and the number climbed towards 300 by the end. They were not one group, but two, legally, and the distinction is going to matter terribly later. Some belonged to George Washington outright. Others were dour people, Custis Estates property attached to Martha's life interest, who could not be sold by either of the Washingtons, and could not be freed by either of them, because they were not theirs. They were, in law, alone. In the house itself, perhaps a dozen worked directly under Martha's hand. A cook, a butler, waiters, seamstresses, a washerwoman, a woman named Betty, brought up from the White House on the Pamunkey in 1759, who was a superb needlewoman and whose daughter you will meet before this evening ends. In the fields, the great majority. Men and women out at first light, weeding, ploughing, harvesting, digging ditches, hauling. In the quarters at night, families formed across the boundaries of the 5 farms, and marriages made that the law did not recognize, and children born who took the enslaved status of their mothers by a Virginia statute of 1662, so that a child born at Mount Vernon in the summer of the Declaration of Independence was born a slave because her grandmother's mother had been one. Martha Washington did not think this was wrong. I am not going to soften that for you. Nothing she ever wrote suggests any moral difficulty with the institution at all, and one letter she wrote to a niece in the 1790s about a dead enslaved child is so cold that it takes the breath out of you. Her husband's mind changed over the course of his life, in slow and self-interested and finally genuine stages, until he did something at the end that almost no other Virginian of his rank ever did. Hers did not change. She was a woman of her class, and her class had built its entire world upon the backs of other people, and she looked at that world and saw the natural order. Both things are true at once, and they have to be held at once. The woman who sat up all night with a feverish child in the quarters was the same woman who believed that child's mother was her property. The 18th century is full of these arrangements. It does not excuse them. It only explains why so many people manage to live inside them without visible strain. Since we are here, let me stay a moment longer and tell you what a week looked like from the other side of that house, because it is a real place with real hours in it, and it is not often described. They worked 6 days. Field hands were called out before sunrise by a horn and worked until dusk, with a break in the middle of the day, longer in summer than in winter. Ploughing, ditching, dunging, sowing, hoeing, harvesting, threshing. When the wheat came in, everybody who could stand went into the field, including the house servants and the children. Overseers kept the count of what each person did in a day and reported it, and the reports went to the general, who compared them with what he thought a person ought to do, and wrote back about it. They were issued food, weekly cornmeal, and salted fish out of the Potomac in the season, and a little meat. It was not enough, and everybody understood that it was not enough. And so the people at Mount Vernon fed themselves. They kept fowl. They planted gardens by their quarters. They hunted and fished and trapped in what little time they had. And on a Sunday, which was their own, some of them walked into Alexandria to sell eggs and chickens and vegetables and ducks in the market, and came back with coin and bought things with it. A few of them owned more than the law believed they could own. They married. The law did not recognize it, and they did it anyway, and because the 5 farms were separated by miles, most of the marriages at Mount Vernon were across the farms, which meant that a man might walk 4 miles at the end of a working day on a Saturday to be with his wife and children and walk back on Sunday night. And a very great number of those marriages were between one of the general's people and one of the dour people. That fact made in the quarters over 40 years by people asserting their own hearts against an inventory, is the fact that later paralyzed him. They resisted, constantly. Tools went missing, work went slowly, sheep and wine and wool and butter were taken, and the accounts complain of it endlessly, and it is the oldest form of protest there is. Some ran. Over the course of his life, at least 47 people tried it, and most were brought back, and the punishments were what they were. The whip in the earlier years, applied by overseers with his knowledge, and worse than the whip, the threat of sail south, away from everybody. By the last count taken in his lifetime, there were 317 people living at Mount Vernon in bondage. 124 belonged to him. 153 were dour people, belonging to the estate of a man who had been dead for 40 years. 40 more were rented from a neighbour. Every hour of the elegant life we have been walking through. The hams, the linen, the shoes traced on paper. The piazza with its Windsor chairs above the river was purchased out of that ledger. Hold that. We will come back to it. In Philadelphia, when a young woman named Ona walks out of a house while the family is at dinner. But now, let us go back to the children, because in the 1760s something was going wrong with the youngest, and nobody could say what. Patsy Custis was a bright, affectionate, ordinary girl. Her stepfather adored her. The account books tell you so more eloquently than any letter could. A tortoise-shell comb, gold earrings, black and white satin pumps ordered from London, a pet parrot, a spinet, and annually, without fail, a new doll for her, dressed in the current London fashion, shipped 4,000 miles. He paid for her music master, John Stadler, and for her dancing lessons with Mr. Christian, and he entered every shilling of it in her guardian account with the pedantic exactness of a man who intended to be able to prove to anybody, at any time, that he had not touched one penny of a child's inheritance. When she was about 11 or 12, she had her first seizure. They called it fits. What we would call it is epilepsy, and in 1768 there was nothing on earth that could be done about it. The Washingtons did everything the age offered, which is to say they did everything, and it was all useless. A physician named Rumney, a former army surgeon, came out to Mount Vernon at least 10 times over 4 years. He prescribed the whole 18th century pharmacopoeia for the falling sickness. Valerian, musk, Peruvian bark, nervous drops, powders. He bled her. Her mother had once, years earlier, given her mercury. They took her to the mineral springs at Warm Springs in the Western Mountains. And I want you to see that expedition, because it is the measure of how far a parent will go. It is 150 miles from Mount Vernon, over the Blue Ridge, on tracks fit for pack horses. They went in the summer of 1769 and took the whole family, and Jackie, and the servants and tents, because there was nothing at the springs but a scatter of huts and a hole in the ground where the hot water came up. They camped. They stayed for weeks. Society of a kind assembled there each season, invalids of every sort sitting in the water and hoping. The general, who did not enjoy sitting in water, wrote home about the crops. Patsy bathed and drank the waters, and had her fits exactly as before. They packed up the tents and came home 150 miles over the mountains, and nothing had changed at all. There is an object in the Mount Vernon collection that I think about more than almost anything else in this story. It is an iron ring, made by a smith, of a kind that people of that era believed would ward off convulsions, and George Washington bought it, and Patsy wore it. He did not believe in charms. He bought it anyway. That is what a parent does at the end of the list. And in the summer of 1770, he began keeping a record. In the margins of a printed almanac, he marked the days on which she was ill. Over one stretch of 86 days, he marked 26. Sometimes twice in a day. He wrote no comment beside these marks. He was a man who counted things, and he counted this. And the almanac page is one of the most terrible documents in American history, precisely because it contains no feeling whatsoever. Now imagine the mother in that house. Imagine the sound a family listens for. Somewhere in the house is a girl who might, at any hour of any day, fall down where she stands. You do not let her go far. You do not let her be alone upstairs. You send an enslaved girl of her own age to sit with her, always. And the enslaved girl learns to listen too. Martha Washington lived inside that listening for a decade. Her letters from those years are full of an anxious, hovering, unspecific dread that she never once names. There was one happier thread running through it. In 1772, a young painter named Charles Wilson Peale came to Mount Vernon and made a miniature portrait of Patsy, a girl of 16 in a low blue gown with a string of pearls, her hair dressed, looking sideways out of the frame with an expression that is amused and a bit reserved and entirely alive. She was, by then, an heiress in her own right, worth well over £2,000 sterling in bank stock and bonds. She was on the edge of the age at which a Virginia girl of her fortune began to be visited by young men. She never got there. The 19th of June, 1773, was a hot day. It had been an odd month. There had been snow on the 11th, freakishly, and then the heat had come down like a lid. The house was full. The Washingtons had guests, as always, among them Eleanor Calvert, a girl of 15 who had lately become engaged to Jackie. They dined at about 2, in the way of the century, and rose from the table around 4. Patsy seemed better that day than she had been for some time. Several people noticed it and said so afterwards. In the way that people always do, she and Eleanor sat talking. Then Patsy went upstairs to her chamber to fetch a letter that had come from her brother at college in New York, because she wanted to show it to her friend. Eleanor heard a sound from the room and went in and found her on the floor, in a seizure. They carried her to the bed. The house came apart. Her mother ran for help. Her stepfather knelt beside her, and in less than 2 minutes, without a word, without a groan, scarcely with a sigh, she was dead. She was 17. The doctors of our own century have gone back over Washington's diaries and his letters and given the thing a name. Sudden, unexpected death in epilepsy. It is a known and dreaded event. It arrives out of nothing. There was no negligence, and there was no warning, and there is no version of that afternoon in which any of them could have saved her. Washington wrote 4 words in his diary that night. About 5 o'clock, poor Patsy Custis died suddenly. That is all. The next day, because the weather was pitiless, they buried her. A carpenter came out from Alexandria overnight to make the coffin, and the funeral service was said over her at the tomb on the slope below the house. And on that day he wrote to his brother-in-law Burwell Bassett, and in the middle of a letter of restrained and formal grief about the sweet innocent girl, he set down a sentence about his wife that I have never been able to get out of my head. This sudden and unexpected blow, he wrote, has almost reduced my poor wife to the lowest ebb of misery. She had now buried 3 of her 4 children. She did not come out of that room for months. When Jackie married Eleanor Calvert the following February at 19, at his mother's insistence, over his stepfather's grave doubts about the boy's readiness for anything at all, Martha Washington was still in mourning and did not attend her only surviving child's wedding. She could not face the crowd. She sent a letter instead, welcoming Eleanor into the family and calling her a daughter, and the girl kept it. Let me tell you about Jackie, because he is the piece of this life that the histories are hardest on, and because his mother loved him without qualification, and to the end. He was clever enough and idle beyond redemption. Tutors despaired of him. A clergyman named Boucher, who took him as a pupil in Maryland, wrote to Washington that the boy's mind was so taken up with dogs and horses and dress that he could get nothing whatever into it, and suggested a tour of Europe as a last resort. Washington, who had taught himself trigonometry at 15 in order to be able to eat, must have found this correspondence a considerable trial of his temper. He sent Jackie to King's College in New York, the institution that is now Columbia, with a great deal of hope and a very expensive letter of credit. Jackie lasted a few months. Then he came home on the strength of his engagement to Eleanor Calvert, and his mother let him. That is the thing that must be said about her and this boy. He was all she had left. She had put 3 children in the ground, and George Washington understood exactly what he was dealing with. And he did not push her. When she wanted Jackie home, Jackie came home. When she was frightened for him, she said so, and it was decisive. The most powerful man in the American colonies, a man whose glance could silence a room of generals, could not get a boy of 19 back to college against the wishes of a woman who was 5 feet tall. And for a few years it was good. Jackie and Ellen and Ellie, everyone, settled at a house called Abingdon up the Potomac, and the babies came in a rush. and Mount Vernon filled up again. There was Elizabeth, known in the family as Betsy, and Martha, known as Patty, and then a third girl, Eleanor, Nellie, like her mother. And in the spring of 1781, a boy, George Washington Parke Custis, whom everybody called Washy, and sometimes, when he was fat and pleased with himself, Tub, grandchildren, a house full of noise. Her husband at 50, planting trees, laying out a new dining room, riding his farms every morning, corresponding about crop rotation and the drainage of a swamp, entirely convinced that he had finished with public life forever. And then Boston. I am not going to give you the coming of the American Revolution, which is not what tonight is for. What I will give you is the way it looked from a plantation on the Potomac, from inside the household of a woman who kept the keys. It arrived as news, the Stamp Act, and the fury over it, and the repeal, the tea duty. The Boston Tea Party in the winter of 1773, and then the closing of Boston's port in retaliation, and then the summer of 1774, when Virginia's burgesses met in the Raleigh Tavern in Williamsburg, because the governor had dissolved them, and appointed a day of fasting and prayer, and George Washington rode home to Mount Vernon and told his wife he had been chosen a delegate to a Continental Congress in Philadelphia. Nothing in the surviving record suggests she opposed any of it. Rumors went about later that she was secretly a loyalist. They were nonsense, put out by people who could not imagine that a woman might have her own politics. She had them. She was, so far as one can judge her, entirely her husband's partisan. She sat at the table where Virginia's leading men argued through the evening. She listened. She said little in writing, because she was not a woman who wrote her opinions down. And she rode over to Alexandria to see the militia companies drilling, and she watched her husband put on his old blue coat again to review them. He went north to the Congress in the spring of 1775, and he went in uniform. She knew what that meant. Everybody in Philadelphia knew what it meant. There was only one delegate in that room who had ever commanded troops in the field, and he had come dressed for it. 19th of April. Lexington and Concord. The countryside of Massachusetts turned out with muskets, and the war began before anybody had declared one. On the 15th of June, the Congress named George Washington Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, and on the 18th he sat down in a rented room in Philadelphia and wrote to his wife. That letter she kept, out of everything, and it is one of the two that survive. He tells her he has done everything in his power to avoid the appointment, from an unwillingness to part with her and the family, and from a consciousness of his own insufficiency. He tells her he could not refuse without dishonoring himself. He tells her it has been a kind of destiny, and that Providence has some good purpose in it. He begs her, and the word is his, not to give way to uneasiness. He tells her he shall feel no pain from the toils and dangers of the campaign. His uneasiness will come from the thought of her being alone and distressed. He has made his will. He asks her to summon her whole fortitude and to spend the summer among her friends. And then he signs himself, as he always did, her most entire and unalterable affection. 5 days later, on the point of leaving Philadelphia for the camp outside Boston, he scribbled her a hurried few lines because he could not go without it, and told her he trusted in Providence, which had been more bountiful to him than he deserved, and that he was in full confidence of a happy meeting with her sometime in the autumn. He did not see Mount Vernon again for 6 years. Think about what those letters actually say to the woman receiving them at Mount Vernon in the last week of June, in the middle of the wheat harvest, with the mercury in the 90s and the house full of guests. He has made his will. He is going to Boston to command an army that does not exist, against the finest professional force in the world, in a rebellion that is, at law, treason. Treason has a punishment attached to it, and every person in Virginia knew what the punishment was. If he lost, he would be hanged. And she, the wife of the arch-traitor, living undefended on a river that a British sloop could sail up in a morning, would be, at the very best, a prisoner and a hostage. There was open talk that year, in more than one British quarter, of seizing her and using her. Her friends urged her to go inland. Lord Dunmore, the royal governor, was raising forces on the coast. Neighbors moved their plate and their families back from the water. Martha Washington stayed on the Potomac. She wrote to a friend, with a plainness that ought to be carved somewhere, that she did not think herself in any danger, and that she had no notion of stirring, and that she thought a great deal too much fuss was being made about it. Eventually, and reluctantly, and only for a spell, she went across to her brother-in-law's place to be less conspicuous. Then, in November, a letter came from Cambridge, Massachusetts, asking her to come to him. She had never in her life been out of Virginia. I want you to sit with that, because it is easy to skate over. She was 44. She had been to Williamsburg and to Annapolis, and up and down the rivers of the Tidewater, and that was the whole extent of the earth as she had touched it. Now she was to travel 500 miles north in November in a coach, over roads that were mud where they were not frozen, and frozen where they were not mud, through Maryland and Pennsylvania and New Jersey and New York and Connecticut, into a country of stone walls and steepled meeting houses and people who spoke a different English, in the middle of a war. She went. She took Jackie and his wife with her, and her nephew, and a manservant and a maid. And the coach was painted, and the horses were good, because her husband had told her that appearances mattered now. What she had not expected was the crowds. At Philadelphia they turned out to see her. The light horse of the city rode out to escort her in. At Elizabethtown, at New Brunswick, at every town of any size, people came into the road to look at the wife of the man who was going to win or lose the whole business. They called her Lady Washington, and she disliked the title and could not stop it, and it followed her for the rest of her days. Congress paid for her journey. Her husband had asked them to, and they thought her presence at the camp worth every shilling of it. Somebody who saw her on that road wrote that she was plain in her dress and modest in her manner, and that she talked to everybody. Nobody, that year or later, ever wrote that she gave herself airs. It is worth remembering that the woman being cheered through New Jersey had, until 11 months earlier, spent her entire adult life within 100 miles of the Pamunkey. At the end of the road, in the second week of December, was Cambridge. The army 20,000 men, or the theory of them, lay in a rough arc around Boston, where the British sat penned inside the town with their fleet in the harbour. Her husband had taken a handsome confiscated house on the Watertown Road for his headquarters. It had belonged to a loyalist who had fled. She walked in on the 11th of December, and cannon fire was audible from the lines, and she wrote afterwards that she had never heard a gun fired in anger before, and that she got used to it more quickly than she had expected to. She stayed until spring, and in doing so she began the thing that she would repeat, without a single exception, for 8 consecutive winters. That first winter in Cambridge is worth a moment on its own, because it is the only one in which she was a novice. The army camped around that house in a great arc, and the British sat in Boston with the fleet in the harbour behind them, and between the two lay a ring of earthworks that neither side much wished to test. Her husband was building an army out of New England farmers who elected their own officers and went home when their enlistments expired, and he was doing it in a state of barely suppressed rage that only his wife ever saw. She set up a household. She had the officers' wives to dinner. He marked the 6th of January, the day she had married him, in a camp in Massachusetts, and there is a quiet pleasure in imagining the sober people of New England being introduced to the festival of a Virginia Twelfth Night. And in March, while she was still there, the general did the thing that made his reputation in that war. Guns dragged 300 miles overland from Ticonderoga through the winter were hauled up onto Dorchester Heights in a single night, and in the morning the British awoke to find artillery looking down their throats, and within a fortnight the whole army and the fleet, and 1,000 loyalist refugees had sailed away, and Boston was free. She was in the town within days. She had gone north expecting to nurse her husband's temper and had instead watched a British army evacuate a city. She wrote to a friend in Virginia about it in a tone of complete astonishment, and then asked after everybody's health. Here was the pattern of the American Revolutionary War. In the campaigning season, from late spring to late autumn, armies marched and fought. In winter they could not. Roads dissolved, forage vanished, men froze, and both sides went into fixed quarters and waited for the ground to harden. The Continental Army's winter encampment was where it was made or lost. It was where men deserted in the thousands, where smallpox and typhus ran through the huts, where officers resigned and Congress failed to pay, and the whole improvised enterprise very nearly evaporated on 4 separate occasions. And every single one of those winters, George Washington wrote to his wife and asked her to come, and every single one of those winters she got into a coach in Virginia and came. Cambridge, Morristown, Valley Forge, Middlebrook, Morristown again, New Windsor, Philadelphia, Newburgh. 8 campaigns, 8 winters, and she was with him for the greater part of the 8 years he was gone. I would like you to feel one of those journeys, because they have been reduced in the retelling to the word she went. She travelled in a coach, which sounds comfortable and was not. It was a box on leather straps. It had no springs as we understand them. The roads between Virginia and New England in the 1770s were the tracks that the country had inherited from the colonial post. Dirt, rutted, cambered wrongly, dissolving under rain, corrugated into iron ridges under frost. There were no bridges over most rivers. There were ferries, and there were fords, and at a ford in December the water came up over the floor of the carriage, and the horses were belly deep, and the driver stood in the traces and swore. She went in the worst months of the year, deliberately, because that was when the army stopped fighting and her husband could have her. 200 miles took a fortnight if the weather turned. There were inns, and the inns were not good. A shared room, a bed you might be expected to share with a stranger, food of an uncertain history, and the whole of the taproom rising to look at Lady Washington when the word ran round. She could not travel unremarked. She was, after 1776, one of the most recognizable women alive, and she was also the wife of the man the British would have paid a great deal to hold. And she went with a small escort and no protection worth speaking of, through country where loyalists were thick on the ground and the roads were not policed. She was 44 when the journeys began. She was 52 when they ended. Somewhere in those 8 winters, she stopped being a woman who had never left Virginia and became, without ever intending it, a national figure recognized, cheered, painted, gossiped about, presented with addresses by corporations obliged to answer them. She never once, in a surviving letter, complained about the roads. But before the second winter, there was a lancet. And I want to give you that scene. Smallpox was killing the American army faster than the British were. It swept through the camps and the northern expedition into Canada was destroyed by it. Inoculation, the deliberate introduction of live smallpox matter into a cut in the arm, which produced a controlled, mild, but entirely real case of the disease, was the only protection, and it carried a genuine risk of death. And Martha Washington was terrified of it, and she had never had the disease. If she was going to spend the war in camps, she had to be inoculated, and she knew it. In May of 1776, in Philadelphia, she consented. They cut her arm, they laid in the matter. Then she waited, alone in lodgings in a strange city, for the fever to come, and it came, and she went through it and lived. And the pox rose and healed, and she was scarred very little. She was 45. Her husband wrote that she was recovering nicely, in the tone of a man who has not been breathing properly for a fortnight. Then came the year in which she was not there, and I think it tells us more about the marriage than any of the years in which she was. She went home to Virginia in the summer of 1776, and the war went to New York, and the war was lost. 20,000 British regulars and Hessians landed on Long Island and beat the Continental Army in the field, and nearly bagged the whole of it. New York burned. Fort Washington fell, and 3,000 men marched into captivity. Most of them died in the prison hulks in the East River, of hunger and typhus, in numbers that exceeded every American battlefield death of the entire war. What was left of the army retreated across New Jersey in November and December with the enemy at its heels, shrinking as it walked. Men's enlistments expired and they went home. By the middle of December, the commander-in-chief had perhaps 3,000 effective soldiers on the wrong bank of the Delaware, in a winter, with Congress fled from Philadelphia and the cause of American independence about 6 weeks from being a footnote in a British history of the colonial disturbances. She was at Mount Vernon. There was no telegraph. There were no reliable newspapers. The post from the north took a fortnight and might not come. What she had was rumor, brought up the road from Alexandria by men who had heard something from somebody in Baltimore. Try to sit in that house with her. Every letter that arrives might be the letter. Her husband is somewhere in New Jersey with the ruins of an army, and if he is taken, he will be hanged, and the estate will be forfeit, and she will be the widow of a traitor. She is 45. She has one living child. She has a plantation to run, a harvest to sell, and 300 people to feed, and she cannot do the only thing she wants to do, which is to be in the room with him. On Christmas night, he took 2,400 men across the Delaware, through drifting ice, and marched them 9 miles in a sleet storm, and took Trenton at daybreak. And 8 days later, he did it again at Princeton, and the war went on. It was the most improbable 10 days of his life, and it saved the Revolution. The news reached her in January. In March, when the roads were passable, she got into the coach and went to him at Morristown, and did not stop coming for 6 more years. Now, I would like to take you into a camp, because the pictures that hang in American schoolrooms have nothing to do with what she actually did there. She was not a nurse in a bonnet handing out soup to grateful soldiers on a snowy hillside, though she did visit the sick and the wounded, and did it regularly. She was something considerably more useful, and something for which there was no name. Start with the headquarters itself. Wherever the army wintered, Washington requisitioned a house, and that house became the nerve center of the American cause. Into it came dispatches, prisoners' letters, spies' reports, complaints, requisitions, and a flood of visiting officers, foreign volunteers, congressional delegates, state governors, Indian delegations, and desperate petitioners of every kind. In it lived the general. His military family of young aides Hamilton was one, and Tench Tilghman, and John Laurens, and the servants and enslaved people who cooked and washed for all of them. It was crowded past the point of decency. Officers slept 4 to a room. Papers covered every table. And into this arrived each winter a woman of 50 who took one look at it and began to run it as a household. She managed the table, feeding the general's staff and the endless stream of official guests on ruined army rations. In a countryside stripped bare was a logistical problem of real difficulty, and it was hers. She decided the seating. She talked to the foreign officers whose English was poor, and she talked to the farmers' wives who came in with butter to sell, and she talked to the congressmen who had come out from Philadelphia to find out whether the army still existed, and she sent all of them away, having formed a good opinion of a cause that, on the evidence of the huts outside, ought to have terrified them. She copied letters. This is not a legend. Her hand is on the drafts. When the aides were overwhelmed, she sat at the general's table and copied his correspondence into the letter books, which meant that she took in and understood the strategic situation of the American army in real time and in detail. She acted as his representative at functions when he could not go. She received the wives of officers, and the wives of officers were a political constituency of no small importance. And she was, for 8 years, the only person on earth in front of whom that man could stop performing. I think that is the true measure of it. There is a certain kind of leadership that requires an unbroken surface, and Washington's whole authority rested on his, the stillness, the imperturbability, the refusal to explain himself. He could not be seen to despair. He despaired regularly. He wrote to his brother in the worst of it that he thought the game was pretty nearly up. Somebody in that house had to see him with the surface, and it could not be Hamilton, and it could not be Congress, and it could not be the army. It was a woman from the Pamunkey who had buried 3 children and did not frighten easily. She had friends there. Lucy Knox, huge and funny and clever, the wife of the bookseller who became the artillery chief. Kitty Green, young and flirtatious and adored, the wife of Nathaniel Green. They sewed together in the evenings and sang and put on plays, and the younger women teased the general, who let them. And she organized the officers' wives into a working circle, knitting, patching, turning old shirts, making socks for men who had none. That sewing has been laughed at now and then by people who think the useful history of a war is fought with muskets. So let me tell you what happened in Philadelphia in the summer of 1780, because it is the largest thing American women did in that war, and Martha Washington's name is stitched right through the middle of it. Charleston had fallen in May. An entire American army had surrendered. The currency was worthless, the soldiers were unpaid, and the mood in the country was as low as it ever got. And a woman named Esther de Burt Reed, English-born, 33, wife of the President of Pennsylvania, and lately recovered from the smallpox herself, sat down and wrote a broadside called The Sentiments of an American Woman and had it printed. It argued, in language that must have made a good many gentlemen put down their coffee, that women had always been capable of public virtue and had always been prevented from exercising it, and that they would now be prevented no longer. Within days, 36 women of Philadelphia formed themselves into an association, the first large organization of women in American history, and went out into the streets. In pairs, unescorted, without their husbands, they knocked on the doors of strangers. They stopped men in the street. They went into taverns. One exasperated Quaker lady recorded that these ladies of the First Society were so importunate that people gave them money simply to be rid of them. They raised, in a few weeks, a sum in paper currency that ran to hundreds of thousands, and a great deal of hard coin besides. Women in New Jersey and Maryland and Virginia copied them. Their plan was to distribute the money to the soldiers directly, $2 a man, in hard coin, so that every private in the Continental line should have something of his own for once. And the structure they designed had, at its head, a single recipient through whom the whole national effort was to be funneled. They named the wife of the commander-in-chief. The general said no. He said it twice, and the second time he was distinctly cool about being asked again. Hard money in the hands of soldiers who were paid in worthless paper would breed resentment among those who missed out, he said, and a proportion of it would go on drink, and the men would be punished for what the ladies had given them. If the association wished to do good, it should buy linen and make shirts and make them itself, so that the money was not spent on seamstresses. Esther Reed was furious and gave way. He was buying the linen in September when she caught a fever and died within days at 33. Sarah Franklin Bache, Benjamin Franklin's daughter, picked up the work. Through the autumn, the women of that city cut and sewed. A French visitor was shown into a room at her house in December and found it heaped, not with embroidery, but with shirts, more than 2,000 of them, and every single one had the name of the woman who made it stitched inside. They went to the army with a message that they hoped the shirts would be worn with as much pleasure as they had been made. That is the world Martha Washington was sewing in. She was not making socks to pass the time. She was the figurehead, and in some measure, the clearinghouse, of the first mass political action by women on that continent, and the general who overruled it was her own husband. The men in the ranks called her Lady Washington, and they meant it kindly, and when she arrived at a camp, the word went round the huts within the hour. There is something worth pausing on in that name, because it tells you how strange her position had become. She had begun life as the daughter of a county clerk, third rung of the ladder, and had married up into the Tidewater aristocracy, and might have expected to end her days as a comfortable dowager, known to a few hundred families along the rivers of Virginia. Instead, she had become, without an office, without a title anyone had voted on, without ever having sought a moment of it, a figure whom soldiers who had never met her spoke of as though they had. Men wrote home about her. A rumor that Lady Washington was coming could steady a camp on the edge of mutiny, because it meant the general meant to stay, and if the general meant to stay, then perhaps the thing was not lost after all. She understood exactly what she was for in that sense, and she did it deliberately. When she arrived, she did not shut herself away with the officers. She went out. She was seen. She spoke to the wives who followed the army, the laundresses and the cooks and the nurses, women with no rank and no protection, who had come along because there was nowhere else for them to be, and she spoke to them as a woman who had spent her whole life running households full of people, which is what they were, and they remembered it. One of them, decades on, still spoke of the day the general's lady had stopped and asked after her children. None of this was in any commission. It is not the kind of thing that gets into the histories of the war, which are histories of marches and battles and the movements of men. But an army in the 18th century was held together as much by belief as by discipline, and a great deal of the belief that held this one together, through 8 winters, was manufactured in the crowded parlour of a requisitioned farmhouse by a short, stout, unhurried woman pouring coffee. Now let us go to the place whose name everybody knows, and let us look at it honestly, because the honest version is stranger and sadder, and more impressive than the painting. Valley Forge is a bend of high ground about 18 miles northwest of Philadelphia, above the Schuylkill River. In December of 1777, the Continental Army marched onto it. 11,000 men. Having lost Philadelphia to the British in September, and having failed to take it back at Germantown in October, the British were now comfortably in the city, in warm houses, dancing. The Americans were on a hillside with no shelter of any kind. Understand first that the winter itself was not exceptional. This surprises people. The temperatures at Valley Forge were unremarkable for Pennsylvania. The following winter, in New Jersey, would be far crueler. What made Valley Forge a byword was not the cold. It was the collapse of the supply system, and it was the mud. They built a city. Men who had never held a broadaxe felled the trees on that hillside and raised, in a matter of weeks, somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 log huts, laid out in streets by regiment, each hut 16 feet by 14, each holding 12 men in bunks 3 deep, each with a clay fireplace at one end, and by order, 1 door and no window. There was no straw for bedding, so they slept on the ground. There were not enough blankets, and there were, in that army, several thousand men without shoes. The commissary failed. Congress had reorganized it, disastrously, in the autumn, and the wagons did not come, and the flour did not come. For days at a stretch there was no meat at all. Men ate fire cake, which is flour and water baked black on a hot stone, nothing else. The soldiers took up a chant that carried across the hillside in the evenings. No bread, no soldier, and it was not mutiny, quite, and everybody knew how close it was. 1,500 horses starved to death. Their carcasses could not be buried because the ground was iron, and then the thaw came and the camp swam in filth. Over the 6 months of that encampment, something in the region of 2,000 men died, not one of them in battle. Typhus, typhoid, dysentery, influenza, and the pneumonia that finishes a body with nothing left in it. 1 man in 6 who marched onto that ground did not march off it. Into this, in the first weeks of February, in Martha Washington's coach. She had left Mount Vernon in the middle of the winter. The roads were appalling. The journey took far longer than it should have. She reached the Schuylkill and crossed it, and came up to the stone farmhouse belonging to a family named Potts, which was the headquarters, and which was so cramped that her husband had ordered a log annex built onto the back of it, so that the staff could have somewhere to eat. She described that house herself, and her description is one of the few glimpses we have of her private eye. The general's quarters, she wrote, had been made more tolerable by the addition of a log cabin to dine in. The room he did business in was about 16 feet square with a large fireplace. The house was stone and the walls were very thick, 16 feet square. In that room, the wall was run, and in the rest of that house, for 5 months, a woman of 46 lived and worked. She rose early, as always. She had a small chamber. She went out among the huts, and she went into the camp hospitals, which were places of a kind of horror that no 18th century lady of her rank should ever have entered. And she took food and clothing, and she sat by men who were dying of camp fever, and she prayed with them if they asked her to. He gathered the officers' wives, Lucy Knox again, and Kitty Green, and Lady Stirling and her daughter, and they sewed. Every afternoon, they patched and turned and mended shirts and stockings brought up from the regiments, and it was not a decorative occupation. It was the difference between a man having a shirt and a man not having one. When the general's birthday came in February, she found a regimental band and had them play for him outside the door, and it is recorded that he came out and stood there while they played, and said very little, as was his way. A Prussian arrived that spring who called himself a baron and a lieutenant general, and was neither, having been a captain, and who spoke no English, and swore magnificently in German and French, while an aide translated the swearing for the troops. His name was Steuben. He took a model company and drilled it himself on the parade ground in the mud, personally, which no European officer of rank would have dreamed of doing, and then those men drilled others. And by June an army that had never been able to change formation without dissolving could march in column, deploy into line, and use the bayonet. He dined at the headquarters table. So did a French boy of 20 who had crossed the Atlantic at his own expense to be near the general, and who was already, in the way of a boy who has found the father he wanted, entirely devoted. The Marquis de Lafayette had a particular gentleness towards Mrs. Washington, and she towards him, and it lasted the rest of their lives. And through the winter, she held dinners. Not balls, she would not hold a ball while the army starved, and she said so, but dinners at which the visiting congressman and these foreign officers sat down with the general, and were fed on whatever could be found, and were talked to and went away persuaded. In the middle of all of them, pouring the coffee, was the mistress of Mount Vernon. There is one episode from that spring that tells you everything about her particular usefulness. In April, 4 Quaker women walked out from Philadelphia, walked through the lines in wartime to petition the commander-in-chief. Their husbands and brothers, Quaker men who had refused on principle to swear an oath of allegiance, had been rounded up and exiled to Virginia, and some had died there, and the women had come to ask for the survivors to be freed. Washington could not simply release them. They were held by the state of Pennsylvania, not by him. What happened instead is that Martha Washington received the women, talked with them, and gave them dinner. Then the general signed a pass allowing them to travel through the American lines unmolested. Pennsylvania's council looked at that pass, understood it as a signal, and let the men go home. She did not sign anything. She never signed anything. She simply made it possible for two sides who distrusted each other to sit in the same room and be human, and the thing got done. Word came in May that France had recognized American independence and would enter the war. The camp was given a day of celebration. There were volleys of musketry fired in sequence down the line, and a shout of huzzah for the King of France, which must have been a peculiar sound in a camp of men who had begun the whole business as loyal subjects of King George. Then the ground dried, and the army marched off after the British, and Martha Washington went home to Virginia to see to the harvest. That was the rhythm. Winter with the army, summer with the farms. The winter that broke everybody was the next one but one. In December of 1779, the army went into quarters at Morristown in New Jersey, in a wooded valley called Jockey Hollow, and the weather that came down on them was the worst recorded in the American colonies in the entire century. The harbors froze. New York Bay froze so solid that cannon were dragged across the ice from Manhattan to Staten Island. There were 28 separate snowfalls at Morristown that season. In early January, a blizzard blew for 2 days and left 4 feet of snow standing, and the huts were buried, and men went without bread for a week at a time and ate their shoes. Martha Washington arrived on the last day of December, and she stayed until June. The headquarters this time was the house of a widow named Theodosia Ford, a handsome place on the Morristown Road. Mrs. Ford and her 4 children were still living in it. Into that house went the general, his wife, 18 servants, and enslaved workers of the 2 households, the general's military family of aides, and a stream of visitors, and they were all crammed into a building that had been built for one family. 2 rooms were left to Mrs. Ford and her children. The kitchen was so overburdened that a log annex had to be run up outside for cooking. The 2 women shared that house for 6 months of the hardest winter of their lives, and there is no record of a crossword. Downstairs, in the small parlor, a court-martial sat in the last week of December on a general officer accused of using his command for private profit. His name was Benedict Arnold. He was reprimanded, mildly. 10 months later, he would try to sell West Point to the British. Upstairs, in that same crowded house, an aide-de-camp of 25 named Alexander Hamilton was falling in love with a young woman who was staying that season with her aunt in the town, whose name was Elizabeth Schuyler. They married the following December. Martha Washington, who missed very little that happened under a roof she was living beneath, was fond of the young men of the general's military family, and they of her, and several of them wrote about her afterwards, with an affection that has nothing dutiful in it. That is the flavour of it. Starvation, mutiny, treason, snow to the eaves, and in the middle of the house a woman keeping a table, keeping a temper, and keeping the general upright. There was one winter of the 8 that was almost gay, and she deserved it. In the winter of 1778 and 79, the army lay at Middlebrook in New Jersey, in country that had not been stripped, with supplies coming in, and the British quiet in New York, and the French now in the war. The generals had their wives with them, Lucy Knox, enormous and delighted. Kitty Green, who was 24 and could talk French with the foreign officers. Lady Sterling. Mrs. Washington. There were dinners 3 or 4 nights a week. There were amateur theatricals. Somebody wrote that the camp had become a species of court. In February, on the anniversary of the French alliance, Henry Knox threw a party at the artillery park at Pluckerman that people talked about for the rest of their lives. There were fireworks. There was a display of 13 arches. There was a ball, and the ball went on until the small hours, and Nathaniel Green wrote afterwards, with a certain awe, that His Excellency and Mrs. Green had danced upwards of 3 hours together, without once sitting down. Hold that picture a moment, with the man in it. 6'3", 47. The most reserved public figure in the Western world who had spent the previous winter at Valley Forge watching his men die of hunger, dancing for 3 hours without a break, in a barn, in New Jersey, because the French had come in and there was suddenly a possibility that this thing might actually be won. And his wife, who had made the journey up from Virginia yet again, sitting at the edge of that room among the officers' wives, watching him. She was 47 herself. There is no record of her dancing that night. There is no record of her minding. The war ground on. He wintered at New Windsor on the Hudson, and at Philadelphia, and everywhere she went the same crowded rooms and the same copied letters and the same anxious summers at Mount Vernon in between, riding out to look at the wheat, writing to Lund, Washington, her husband's cousin and steward, about the mill and the fishery and the herring run. And in the spring of that year the war came at last up her own river. Understand what those 8 years cost the place. Mount Vernon in wartime was run by Lund, Washington, the general's distant cousin and steward, a conscientious and rather unimaginative man who wrote long anxious letters to his employer about wheat prices and repairs and got long anxious letters back. The estate lost money for most of the war. The general refused to take a salary and asked only that his expenses be met, and his expenses over 8 years came to a figure that made Congress blink, and a considerable portion of them were the cost of his wife's coach going north and coming home. She was at Mount Vernon in the summers, riding the farms, seeing to the fishery on the Potomac, where in the spring the shad and the herring came up, the river in such numbers that the seines were hauled day and night, and the fish were salted by the barrel and sold. She was there, and everybody in Virginia knew she was there, and the Potomac was open water. In April of 1781, a squadron of British and Loyalist vessels came up the river burning the houses of rebels along both banks. Among them was a 16-gun sloop of war, His Majesty's ship Savage. On the 12th of April, her boats came to the Mount Vernon landing. The captain sent word ashore demanding provisions, and made it plain what would happen if they were refused. Lund, Washington went out to the ship. He took poultry and supplies aboard. He asked, at the same time, for the return of some property, and the house on the hill was not burned, while the houses of the general's neighbours went up in smoke, one after another, all along the shore. The property he asked for was 17 people. They had gone aboard that ship, in the confusion, in a bid for their freedom. We know their names because Lund wrote a list of them, in the manner of a man taking an inventory of lost goods. Peter, Louis, and Frank, all of them old. Frederick, 45, an overseer. Gunner, 45, a brickmaker. Harry, about 40, who kept the horses. Tom and Sambo, both 20. Thomas, a house servant of 17. Another Peter, a boy of 15. Stephen, a cooper of 20. James, 25. Watty, a weaver of 20. Daniel, 19. And 3 women, Lucy, who was 20. Esther, who was 18. And Deborah, who was 16. The British had been offering freedom to any enslaved person who could reach their lines since 1775. 17 of them reached it in a boat, from the bottom of the general's own lawn, and asked no permission from anybody. The captain did not give them back. When the news reached George Washington in New York, he wrote his steward a letter that people still argue about. He was sorry for Lund's losses and a little sorry for his own. But what gave him most concern, he said, was that his cousin had gone aboard the enemy's vessels and furnished them with refreshments. He would have been less pained, he wrote, to hear that they had burned his house and laid the plantation in ruins. Look at that sentence closely. Not one word about the 17 people. His concern is the dishonor of the transaction and the appearance of a commander whose own estate was spared while his neighbors burned. After Yorktown, 7 of the 17 were recaptured and brought back and put to work again. Frederick, Frank, Gunnar, Sambo, Thomas, Lucy, Esther. 7 of the rest vanish out of the paper altogether, and there is no way now to know whether they died of camp fever in a British hold or lived out long free lives under other names. 3 we can follow: Deborah Squash and Daniel Payne and Harry. The man who had kept the horses went out with the British fleet at the end of the war and were carried to Nova Scotia as free people. Harry took the surname Washington because it was the only one he had ever been given, and in 1792 he sailed with a company of black settlers to Sierra Leone, and there, an old man, he took part in a rising against the colonial government that had broken its promises to him and was sentenced and sent away. He is the only person in this evening's story who fought 2 governments for the same thing and got it from neither. His mistress does not seem ever to have written a word about the ship, or about any of them. It was in the terrible bookkeeping of that house, a loss of stock. In the summer of 1781, the whole war turned. A French fleet came up out of the Caribbean and shut the mouth of the Chesapeake, and Lord Cornwallis's army, which had marched itself deep into Virginia, found itself pinned against the sea at a tobacco port called Yorktown. Washington marched south from New York with the French army beside him, moving faster than he had ever moved in his life, and on the way he stopped at Mount Vernon. It was the 9th of September, 1781. He had not stood in that house in 6 years and 3 months. He was there for 3 days. His wife had the whole French general staff to dinner. Then they all rode away down the peninsula, and she went with them as far as she could, and then turned back. And with the army, riding as a civilian aide to his stepfather, went John Parker Custis, aged 26. He had spent the war at home comfortably, doing very little. His mother had preferred it that way. Now, at the 11th hour, with the thing nearly finished, he wanted to see it, and he wrote to Washington asking to be taken on his staff, and Washington, who had never in his life been able to refuse this family anything, took him. Yorktown was besieged for 3 weeks. The lines drew in, the batteries came up, the redoubts were stormed on a night in October by Hamilton and the French together, and on the 19th Cornwallis's army marched out between 2 lines of soldiers and grounded its arms while a band played, and the American Revolution was, though nobody could be certain of it for 2 more years, effectively won. And in the camp outside the town, in the filth and the standing water, the fever was moving through the men. They called it camp fever. It was typhus, or something very near it, and it did not distinguish between a general's stepson and a private soldier. Jackie Custis fell ill during the siege. He was carried 30 miles to the house of his uncle Burwell Bassett at Eltham, and there he lay, and there they sent for his mother. She came. So did his wife Eleanor. So, when the surrender was over, did George Washington, riding up from Yorktown at speed. On the 5th of November, 1781, 2 weeks before his 27th birthday, John Parker Custis died with his mother in the room. Martha Washington had now buried 4 children, all 4. Every child born of her body was in the ground before she was 51, and the last of them died in the very month that her husband became the most celebrated man in the Western world. I have gone looking for what she said about it, and there is almost nothing. A niece wrote that she was very much afflicted. Washington wrote to a friend that Mrs. Washington's distress was not to be described. There is no letter of hers from that November. She was 50. She went home to Mount Vernon in a coach with her widowed daughter-in-law and 4 fatherless grandchildren, the eldest 6, the youngest 6 months. And then she did the thing she always did, which was to take the children. Eleanor Custis was 23 and about to be pursued quite properly by other men. It was agreed, in the way these things were agreed among Virginians, that the 2 eldest girls would stay with their mother, and that the 2 youngest would be raised at Mount Vernon. So Nellie, aged 2, and Washie, aged 6 months, came into that house and were brought up by their grandmother and by the man they would call grandpapa, and the empty rooms filled up with a small girl's music lessons and a small boy's alarming lack of application to his books. George Washington, at 49, having lost his own children before they were born, acquired a second family in the same season he lost the first. There were 2 more years of war to sit through, and they were the strangest of the whole business. A war that everybody knew was over, in which nobody would say so, in which the army sat in cantonments up the Hudson Valley waiting for a peace treaty being negotiated in Paris by men they had never met and were not paid, and grew bitter. The Washington spent those years at Newburgh, in a stone Dutch farmhouse belonging to a family named Hasbrouck, above the river. She came up in the coach in the autumn of 1782 and stayed nearly a year, and planted a garden, and sowed, and received. It was the least dramatic of all her winters, and I suspect the loneliest, because the army had nothing to do, and her husband was fighting his own officers. In March of 1783, an anonymous address circulated in that camp, urging the officers to march on Congress and take by force the pay they had been promised. It was the closest the United States has ever come to a military coup. Washington walked into the meeting, uninvited, and spoke to them, and it did not move them. And then he took out a letter from a congressman and fumbled with it, and reached into his pocket for a pair of spectacles that almost none of them had ever seen him wear, and said quietly that he had grown grey in their service and now found himself growing blind. Men who had marched from Boston to Yorktown wept, and the mutiny died in that room. His wife was in the house a few hundred yards away. He would have come back to that house afterwards and taken off the coat and sat down. There is no record of what passed between them. There never is. That is the shape of this marriage. 40 years of the most consequential events in the history of a nation, and at the center of it a closed door. In April, the cessation of hostilities was proclaimed to the army. In the summer, she went home, and on the road through Pennsylvania, the assembly presented her with a coach. And when she reached Virginia, the city of Williamsburg gave her gold medals and the freedom of the city, and she accepted all of it with the polite, unimpressed courtesy of a woman who wanted to know whether the hams had been properly hung. In November, the treaty came. Her husband went to New York to watch the British sail away, and said goodbye to his officers in a tavern on Pearl Street with tears running down his face, and then he rode south. On the 23rd of December, at Annapolis, before the Congress of the United States, he did the thing that made him, in the estimation of the world, the greatest man of his age. He gave the army back. He resigned his commission. He handed over the sword. King George III, hearing that he intended to do it, is said to have remarked that if he did, he would be the greatest man in the world. Then he got on his horse and rode the 50 miles home through the frost, and reached Mount Vernon on Christmas Eve, in the evening, in 1783, after 8 years and 6 months. There were presents in his baggage. He had stopped in Annapolis and bought them, and he had written the list down, because he wrote everything down. A locket, 3 pocketbooks, 3 thimbles, 3 sashes, a dress cap, a hat, a whirligig, a fiddle, a gun, and boxes of quadrille counters. For the grandchildren, that, and not Yorktown, is the picture I would like you to hold as you drift. A very tall man in a plain coat, 51, coming up the lane in the dark on Christmas Eve with a fiddle and a whirligig in his saddlebags, and a woman of 52 standing in the door of a house she had kept alive for 8 years, and 4 small children behind her skirts, and beyond them the fires lit in every room. For 5.5 years after that Christmas Eve, they were happy, and it is worth staying in those years a while, because they are the only stretch of her later life she got to choose. He was 52 and she was 52, and they had a house to put back together. 8 years of war had left Mount Vernon shabby, and the farms exhausted. He set about it the way he set about everything, with a plan and a notebook. He built the piazza, the wide colonnaded porch on the riverfront, 2 stories high, an idea nobody in Virginia had had before, so that on a hot afternoon the family could sit in the shade of it, with the Potomac laid out below, and a breeze coming up off the water. He finished the new dining room in a pale green he had chosen himself. He laid out a bowling green and serpentine walks and planted, with his own hands, hundreds of trees, native ones brought in from his own woods. Let me put the estate in front of you properly, because by now it was not a plantation but a small country, 8,000 acres divided into 5 farms, each with its own overseer and its own quarter and its own barns. The Mansion House Farm, on the ridge above the river, where the family lived. Union Farm, Dogue Run, Muddy Hole, River Farm. Between them, at various times, more than 300 people. A grist mill that ground flour of a quality good enough to be shipped to the West Indies under the Washington brand and sold without inspection. A fishery on the Potomac taking 1 million herring in a good spring. A distillery, later, that became one of the largest in the country. Weavers, coopers, blacksmiths, brickmakers, carpenters, spinners, a shoemaker who had been his own body servant through the war and had come home crippled, and the 16-sided barn he designed himself, in which horses trod out the wheat under cover, on a floor built with gaps between the boards, so the grain fell through to the story below. It is the invention of a man who has thought about a problem for years. The mansion by now was what you have seen in photographs, and it is worth knowing that almost none of it is what it appears to be. The great house is timber. The stone facing is not stone at all. It is pine, cut into blocks, painted, and dusted with sand, while the paint was tacky, so that from 20 feet away it looks like rusticated masonry. It fooled visitors then, and it fools them now. He had a general's understanding of what a thing must look like from a distance. Inside, the pale green dining room with its plaster ceiling of harvest emblems. The passage running through with the doors open at both ends in summer, and on the east front, the piazza with its 8 square pillars, and the plain Windsor chairs, and the ground falling away to the water, and beyond the water the Maryland shore. She had the house, the grandchildren, the visitors, and the keys. The grandchildren were the joy of it, and she made no secret of the fact. Nellie Custis grew into a beauty of alarming self-possession, who played the harpsichord for hours a day because her grandmother required it and complained bitterly about it in later life. Washi was indulged by everybody and disciplined by nobody and grew up delightful and useless, and George Washington's letters to that boy about the necessity of application to study are among the funniest and most despairing documents in the American archive, and the visitors returned, in numbers that beg a belief. He was the most famous private citizen in the world. Anybody who could invent an excuse came up the lane. Foreign travelers, painters, veterans of his army, congressmen, French officers, English tourists come to see the phenomenon. In one 12-month of that period, the household recorded something above 600 overnight guests. They had to be fed, and their horses stabled, and their beds made, and the linen washed, and Martha Washington did it, season after season, at her own expense, with a courtesy that never once cracked in front of a stranger. She was in her middle 50s. She had a bad tooth and stomach complaints, and she was stout, and she wore the enormous white mob caps that everybody remembered afterwards. Painters came and painted her, a round, sensible, watchful face, not beautiful any longer, and not trying to be. I want to spend a while with her correspondence, because it is where she actually lived, and because it is nearly all that is left of her private voice. She wrote constantly. To her sister Anna Maria, 30 years of it. To her nieces. To her sisters-in-law. To the wives of officers she had spent winters with. She wrote about health, always health. Who was breeding, who was cutting a tooth, who had the ague, what she recommended, what she had sent. She wrote about cloth and patterns, and a watch she had bought in New York and was sending down by a Mrs. Sims. She sent presents constantly and in every direction. And in among the muslin and the teething there are, without warning, sentences of such flat and unornamented sadness that you have to sit back from them. Anna Maria died in 1777, in the middle of the war, while Martha was at Mount Vernon, waiting for her daughter-in-law to be brought to bed of a child. She had already lost her father and her mother and her brother, and by the end of the century, almost every one of the 8 children who grew up at Chestnut Grove would be dead before her. Into the gap came the nieces, and this is the pattern of her later life. She gathered other people's children. Fanny Bassett, Anna Maria's daughter, came to live at Mount Vernon as a girl and was, everybody said, the nearest thing to a daughter that Martha Washington had after 1773. Fanny married Washington's nephew and lived on the estate and bore 3 children, and buried her husband and then died herself of consumption at 29. The letter about the muslin apron and the watch, the one in the middle of which the words about the state prisoner appear, is written to Fanny. There was Harriet Washington, a niece of her husband's, given a home and a wardrobe and instructions on economy. There were the two elder Custis granddaughters, Betsy and Patty, who came and went and were written to and worried over. There was Nellie, raised as her own. There was Washi, indulged past redemption. None of it was tidy. The house at Mount Vernon in the 1780s held, at various moments, a general, his wife, two grandchildren, a niece and her husband and their babies, a secretary, a nephew or two, an unspecified number of long-staying guests, and an enslaved community of hundreds, all of it revolving around a woman in her 50s with a bunch of keys at her waist. Her handwriting is a plain, round, slanting hand. Her spelling is her own. Her sentences run on without punctuation and then stop dead. There is no literary ambition anywhere in them, and in the handful of her letters that survive you can find more of what a woman's life actually contained in that century than in all the orations delivered over her husband's coffin. They both believed it would last. He wrote to Lafayette that he had returned to his vine and fig tree, and that he meant to move gently down the stream of life until he slept with his fathers. He meant it entirely. And then the country he had made began to come apart, and the men who had made it with him started arriving at Mount Vernon with a proposition. The Confederation was failing. The states quarreled, the debt went unpaid. Farmers in Massachusetts rose in armed revolt over foreclosures, and it became apparent to a certain group of men that the arrangement of 1777 would not hold. There was a convention at Philadelphia in 1787. He did not want to go. He went. He presided over it in almost total silence for 4 months, and the Constitution came out of that room, and everybody in America understood one thing about it that was never written down. It created a presidency of frightening power, because everybody knew who the first president would be, and everybody trusted him. The electors were unanimous. They have never been unanimous again. He learned of it on the 14th of April, 1789. When the Secretary of the Congress arrived at Mount Vernon with the certificate. 2 days later, he left for New York. He wrote in his diary that he set out with a mind oppressed with more anxious and painful sensations than he had words to express. To a friend, he wrote that his movements to the chair of government would be attended with feelings not unlike those of a culprit going to the place of his execution. His wife did not go with him. She stayed at Mount Vernon for a month, seeing to the house, and she wrote to her nephew a sentence that says everything the general's more decorated laments do not. She thought it much too late for him to go into public life again, but it was not to be avoided. That is the voice of a young woman of 57 who wanted her husband at home, who had already given the country 8 winters and 1 son, and who understood perfectly that she was not going to be asked. In the middle of May, she set out. The coach went north with her, and her nephew Robert Lewis, aged 20, who kept a journal of the journey, and Nellie, aged 10, and Washi, aged 8, and 7 enslaved people from Mount Vernon, among them Ona Judge, Betty's daughter, a seamstress of about 16 who had become Martha Washington's personal maid. Hold that name. She is riding north in this coach. Robert Lewis's journal of that fortnight is a remarkable thing. The first morning, as the coach was loaded, the enslaved household at Mount Vernon came out to see the mistress go, and he wrote, there were tears. Some of them were weeping, and he found the scene painful, and could not stay to watch it. He does not tell us what the people weeping were thinking. It is not hard to guess. Their world was being rearranged again by other people's decisions. Some of them were being taken hundreds of miles from husbands and children, and none of them had a vote in any of it. The journey took a week, and it was a triumph. At Baltimore, the citizens came out in the evening with fireworks. At Philadelphia, the light horse rode out to meet her and escorted her in, and a crowd waited in the street, and the ladies of the city gave a reception. At Chester and at Trenton and at Elizabethtown, more crowds. She was met on the New Jersey shore and taken across to Manhattan in a barge rowed by 13 pilots in white uniforms, and cannon fired from the battery as she came across the water. And the governor of New York was waiting on the wharf with her husband. It was the 27th of May, 1789. Now imagine standing on that landing stage. She is nearly 58, her birthday a few days off. Behind her, the whole Atlantic seaboard has just cheered her through it. In front of her is a city of 30,000 people that was, 5 years earlier, an occupied British garrison town, and which she has never seen. Her husband, whom she has scarcely had at home for 14 of the last 25 years, is now the head of a government that does not yet exist, in a nation with no precedent for anything, and she, a planter's widow from the Pamunkey with no education to speak of, and a spelling all her own, is expected to invent, out of nothing, the public position of the wife of the head of that government. Nobody had told her what she was. There was no title. The Senate spent weeks in solemn debate about what to call her husband, His Highness, His Elective Majesty, Protector of the Liberties of the United States, and settled mercifully on President. For her they proposed nothing at all. Lady Washington, which she had never asked for, and could not stop, is what she was called for the whole 8 years, and some wrote of her, half in mockery, as our Lady Presidentess. And she got to work, because that is what she did. The house was on Cherry Street, uptown, facing the East River, 3 stories and 5 windows wide, and it had been leased by the Congress and refurnished at public expense before she saw it. She approved of it, and wrote to her niece Fanny that it was handsomely furnished, and then complained, in the same letter, that she had not been able to get out of it. Downstairs there was an office, and a dining room for state occasions, and a lesser parlour behind it. Upstairs, a withdrawing chamber and the family bedrooms. Above that, the secretaries. Above them, in the 3rd story and the attic, the servants, and I want to be exact about who they were. About 20 people staffed that household. Some were hired white servants, some were indentured. The steward was Samuel Francis, a free man of colour who had kept the tavern on Pearl Street, where the general had said goodbye to his officers. And 7 were enslaved men and women brought north from Mount Vernon, who slept in the attic of the house of the President of the United States, and who were paid nothing, and whose names were Austin, Christopher Shields, Giles, Paris, Molly, Oney Judge, and William Lee. They invented the office in that house, and they invented it under a microscope. There was no precedent for a single thing. If the president dined at a private citizen's table, he was showing favour. If he did not, he was aloof. If he shook hands, he was vulgar. If he bowed, he was a monarch. If he received all callers, he would never do any work. And in the first weeks he tried it, and could not open a letter, because the callers filled every hour from breakfast until dark. So they made rules. On Tuesday afternoons, the president held a levee, for gentlemen only. At 3 o'clock exactly, he stood among them in black velvet with a dress sword at his hip, and his hair powdered, and each visitor was announced and bowed, and formed part of a circle along the walls, and at 4 o'clock the doors were opened and it was over. There was no handshaking, there was very little pleasure. It was widely disliked, and it worked. And on Friday evenings Mrs. Washington held her drawing room. That was a different thing altogether, and it was hers. Ladies came, and gentlemen came with them, and anybody respectable might come without an invitation. Congressmen came, foreign ministers came, the mayor's wife came, and the wives of clerks. She sat, and she did not rise for anybody, because the moment she rose for a duchess, she would have created a rank, and there were to be no ranks. Her husband came in as a private gentleman wearing no sword, and moved about talking easily, and the difference between him at his Tuesday levee and him at his wife's Friday evening was the difference between a statue and a man. She served tea, and coffee, and lemonade, and cake, and ice cream, which was a novelty then, and which the president could eat, having by that stage of his life almost no teeth of his own. At 9 o'clock she rose and said that it was time for everybody to go to bed, and everybody went. It is recorded that she said it in exactly those words, week after week, for 8 years, and that nobody ever took offence, and that some of them treasured it. Do you see what she was doing? There is a very difficult thing being attempted here, and it is not decoration. The new republic had to be dignified enough that the ambassadors of European courts did not laugh at it, and plain enough that a farmer in Massachusetts did not conclude that his revolution had produced a king. The margin was narrow, and every faction in the country was watching, and the newspapers were vicious. Anti-federalists called the levees courtly, and her drawing rooms queenly, and the celebration of the president's birthday a monarchical prettiness. Some of the mockery was aimed at her personally. She stood in that gap for 8 years, in a plain gown, serving lemonade, refusing to rise. And going to bed at 9? Let me stop the clock on a Friday evening and tell you what the people in the room saw, because we have very few descriptions of her, and they agree with one another to a suspicious degree. She was short and by now stout. Her hair was white, and she wore it under a plain white cap of the sort that a Virginia housewife wore, and she wore it in a room full of women in feathers. Her gowns were good, but they were not extravagant, and more than one visitor recorded with surprise that the president's wife was dressed with less display than the wives of the men who worked for her husband. Abigail Adams came to see her in that first summer in New York, and Abigail Adams was one of the sharpest and least sentimental judges of character in America, and she did not like very many people. She wrote to her sister that Mrs. Washington's manners were modest and unassuming, dignified and feminine, and that there was not a particle of affectation about her, and that she received her with such an easy politeness that she felt she had known her for years. Abigail was, at the time, the wife of the vice president, and thoroughly prepared to be unimpressed. Others noticed the same thing. She remembered names. She asked about the children of people she had met twice. She never, in 8 years, was reported to have said an unkind thing about anybody in public, which for a woman in the middle of the most vicious political decade in American history is a piece of discipline that ought to be studied. And she was funny, in a dry way that the record only glimpses. She teased her husband. She teased the young officers. She told her nieces to marry a man of good sense and not to expect anything more romantic than that, and then went home to a marriage that everybody who saw it described as unusually tender. What she was not was an intellectual, or a wit, or a political thinker, or a writer. Nobody has ever pretended otherwise, least of all her. What she had was the thing that cannot be acquired, an unshakable, unhurried, ordinary steadiness, in rooms where nobody else had it. And she hated it. Let me put in front of you the sentence that survives, from a letter she wrote to Fanny Bassett in October of that first year in New York, the sort of letter women wrote to one another about watch chains and muslin aprons. In the middle of the household chatter, without warning this. She lived a very dull life there, she wrote, and knew nothing of what passed in the town. She never went to any public place. Indeed, she thought herself more like a state prisoner than anything else. There were certain bounds set for her which she must not depart from. And as she could not do as she liked, she was obstinate, and stayed at home a good deal. There is not one word of self-pity in it, and there is not one word of pretense either. She was 58, and famous, and constantly attended, and utterly bounded. The cabinet had determined that the president could not accept private invitations, lest he seem partisan, and so his wife could not either. Every day she had to be dressed and have her hair done and receive whoever came. She could not walk out to a friend's for an evening. She could not go to a public assembly. She, who had spent 40 years opening her door to whoever rode up the lane, now lived where the door itself was managed by a secretary. The country got its precedent. She got the bounds. In the winter of that first year, her husband nearly died. A tumour in his thigh, and a surgeon cutting for it without anything for the pain, and weeks of fever. And she had the street outside closed off with chains so that the noise of carriage wheels would not disturb him. In the spring he took influenza, and again they thought he would go. She sat with him. Then he recovered and went off on a tour of New England, and she wrote her letters and held her Friday evenings and counted the months. In the summer of 1790, the Congress voted to move the capital. There would one day be a federal city on the Potomac, 10 miles square, and in the meantime the government would sit at Philadelphia. And so in November the whole apparatus went south, and the household was installed in a large brick house on High Street, which everybody called Market Street, that belonged to the financier Robert Morris and had lately been occupied by the British commander-in-chief. Philadelphia was the largest and richest city in the United States. 40,000 people, brick footways, street lamps, a theatre, a circus, learned societies, and the most sophisticated society in the country. It was grander than Cherry Street. She had a proper drawing room. Nellie went to a fashionable school. Washi did not apply himself. The Philadelphia household was a considerable machine, and she ran it as she had run the White House on the Pamunkey 30 years before. There were about 24 servants. There was a steward. There were coachmen for the cream-coloured coach with its 6 horses, which the newspapers criticised, and which was the plainest carriage of state in the Western world, and still too grand for a republic. There were hired white servants, indentured servants, and 8 enslaved people from Mount Vernon. And in the kitchen there was Hercules. He was the president's cook, and he was an artist, and the city of Philadelphia knew it. His kitchen was famous. He ran it like a drill sergeant, with undercooks and scullions terrified of him and his own son Richmond among them. And the food that came out of it was talked about at every table in the capital. He had privileges. He was allowed to sell the leavings of the kitchen for his own account, and he cleared some $200 a year by it, which was a working man's wage, and he spent it on clothes. Washi Custis, who was a boy in that house, remembered him going out in the evening in a black velvet coat and a cocked hat and a gold-headed cane, and being greeted in the street. Remember him. He is going to come back. The Thursday dinner was for the Congress. Members of both chambers were invited in rotation with their wives, and they came, and a senator from Pennsylvania has left an account of one of these evenings that is very nearly cruel. The food excellent, the wine good, the president drumming his fingers on the table with his fork, and not a word said by anybody for minutes together. He was not a talker. She was. Down her end of the table, the conversation went along quite happily, and she asked after everybody's children by name. On Friday, her drawing room. On Tuesday, his levee. On New Year's Day, an open house, and on the 4th of July, another. And the crowds came through the rooms and were given punch and cake. And Abigail Adams, who had seen a court, said that the first day of January in 1790 was as crowded as a birth night at St. James, and the company as brilliantly dressed, allowing for the absence of diamonds and hoops. 2 more things belong to those Philadelphia years, and neither of them is in the paintings. The first is the fever. In August of 1793, in the hottest summer anybody could remember, the yellow fever came into Philadelphia off a ship from the Caribbean. It began at the wharves. By September it was everywhere. People bled from the gums and turned the colour that gave the disease its name and died in 3 days. Nobody knew that it was carried by a mosquito. The physicians disagreed violently about everything and bled their patients, and killed a good many of them. The city emptied. 20,000 people ran, which was half the population. The federal government simply ceased to exist for a season. The clerks went home, the Congress could not meet, the president was at Mount Vernon. Those who stayed, and the free black community of Philadelphia stayed in numbers, nursing the sick on the false belief that they were immune, and buried the dead, and were repaid with slander, afterwards watched carts go through the streets calling for bodies. Before it ended, in November, when the frost came and killed the mosquitoes, 5,000 people had died. 1 in 10 of everybody in the city. The Washingtons had gone home for the summer, as they always did. Her husband came back to the outskirts of the plague city alone in November, and would not let her follow until he was sure. And when the household reassembled, one of the dead was Polly Lear, the young wife of Tobias Lear, who had lived in the president's house and whose funeral the president attended. The only funeral he attended in 8 years in office. The second thing is the newspapers. The first term had been an interlude of something close to unanimity, and it ended. By the second, the country had discovered political parties and had gone at each other with a ferocity that would embarrass a modern age. The papers of the opposition called the president a monarchist, a hypocrite, a man of no ability who had been carried by better men, a would-be king. One of them, in the last year, printed that the American nation had been debauched by his example, and that his name gave a currency to political iniquity. He saw all of it. He minded, terribly, and could not say so. And they went after her too. The drawing rooms were queenly. The birthday celebrations were monarchical. There was a court forming in Philadelphia, and the woman at the head of it curtsied to nobody and would not rise for anybody, and was clearly setting herself up as a species of American duchess. She was a woman who could not go to a friend's house for tea, because a cabinet had ruled it improper. She was serving lemonade in a rented room and going to bed at 9. In 1794, the western counties rose against the excise on whiskey, and her husband put on his uniform and rode out at the head of 13,000 militia to put the rising down, and she watched him go, at 62, in the same old coat. In 1795, a treaty with Britain, negotiated by John Jay, split the country so badly that men were burned in effigy from Boston to Charleston, and Jay said he could have travelled the coast by the light of his own bonfires, and the president spent the worst weeks of his public life defending it. She said nothing about any of it in writing. What she said privately, to the man who came upstairs at the end of those days, we will never know because of what she did with the letters. And there was something else about Pennsylvania, which the President of the United States had noticed at once, and which he took steps to manage. In 1780, in the middle of the war, the state of Pennsylvania had passed an act for the gradual abolition of slavery. It did not liberate anybody at a stroke. What it did was declare that no child born in Pennsylvania after that date could be born a slave, and that any enslaved person brought into the state by a non-resident and kept there for 6 continuous months would become a free person by the working of the law. 6 months, continuous residence. The President of the United States took legal advice on this from his Attorney General, and then he wrote to his secretary Tobias Lear, and the letter survives, and it is one of the most uncomfortable documents in the founding archive. The enslaved people of the presidential household must be sent out of Pennsylvania before the 6-month term elapsed, and then brought back, so that the clock started again. It must be done, he wrote, on a pretext that might deceive both the public and the enslaved people themselves. He did not want it known. He asked that Mrs. Washington's name be used, since it would look like nothing more than the mistress sending her servants home on an errand. And so, for 6 years, the enslaved men and women who cooked and served and sewed in the president's house in Philadelphia were shuttled back and forth across the state line, to Mount Vernon, to New Jersey, on a contrived errand, for a few days, and then returned for the sole purpose of preventing them from becoming free. They were not fools. They knew what a community of 2,000 free black people looked like, because it was outside the door. They knew what the law said, because the abolitionists of Philadelphia made sure that everybody knew. And in the spring of 1796, a young woman in that house decided she had had enough of it. Her name was Ona Judge. Everybody called her Oni. She had been born at Mount Vernon around 1773. Her mother was Betty, the seamstress, a dour woman of the Custis estate, brought up from the Pamunkey. Her father was Andrew Judge, a white English tailor working out an indenture on the plantation, who finished his term and went away to farm his own land and left his daughter behind, because by Virginia law a child followed the condition of the mother, and the mother was a slave. At 9 or 10 she was brought into the mansion. She learned her mother's trade and became, by common agreement, a needlewoman of unusual skill, and by her middle teens she had been given the most intimate post in the household. She was Martha Washington's body servant. Understand what that means. She dressed her. She did her hair. She was in the room when the great lady was neither great nor a lady, but a stout, tired woman of 60 being laced into her stays. She went with her everywhere, on the road to New York, into the Friday drawing rooms, up and down the stairs of the president's house, to Trenton and back on the errand designed to keep her from becoming free. She heard every conversation in that family for 7 years. She was, so far as anybody could tell from the outside, a favorite. In the spring of 1796, Ona Judge, then about 22, learned something. Mrs. Washington intended to give her away as a wedding present to her granddaughter Elizabeth Parke Custis, who was marrying and setting up a household of her own. She had spent 5 years in Philadelphia. She had a life there, in the free black community, in the churches, on the streets. And she understood exactly what was being decided about her. She would be handed over as an item to a young woman she did not care for, and she would be a slave until she died. And so would her children. She made her preparations quietly. On a May evening, while the president and his wife sat at dinner, she walked out of the house with her things and disappeared into the city. And friends whose names have never been recovered hid her and put her on a ship. The ship was the Nancy, bound for Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Now watch what the Washingtons did, because this is where the marble comes off. The President of the United States advertised for her. He used the Customs Service, the federal machinery of the government he headed, to look for her. When a friend's daughter recognized her in the street at Portsmouth, he wrote to the collector of customs there and asked him to seize her and put her on a ship south, quietly, without any public disturbance. The collector, a decent man named Whipple, interviewed her instead and found a young woman perfectly composed, who said that she would return of her own accord if she were promised her freedom at the Washingtons' deaths, and who otherwise would not. Whipple reported this. Washington rejected it out of hand and called it a premature reward for infidelity. Think about that offer for a moment. She was not asking for wages or for an apology. She was asking for the promise that had been made in the general's will to his own people and could never be made to hers, that at the end of 2 old lives she would belong to herself. And the President of the United States, who by then had drafted the will that would liberate his own 123, refused it and used the word infidelity about a woman he had held in bondage since her birth. Portsmouth was a small town, and she could not hide in it. She lived openly and worked, and the whole of the free black settlement there and half the white town knew who she was, and nobody gave her up. She married a free black sailor named Jack Staines and had a child. 3 years later, in 1799, Washington sent his wife's nephew, Burwell Bassett, to New Hampshire on business, with instructions to take her by force if he could. Bassett dined with a senator named Langdon and announced the plan over the table. Langdon, appalled, sent a servant running through the streets to warn her. An owner judge took her infant daughter and fled to the neighboring town of Greenland and hid with a free black family called the Jacks until Bassett gave up and went home. She was never taken. She lived in New Hampshire for another half-century, and she was poor for all of it, and she buried both her daughters, and her son went to sea. She learned her letters, which she had not been taught, and joined a church of her own choosing. And in the 1840s, an old woman living on charity in Greenland, she sat down with 2 abolitionist newspapermen and gave the only account of the inside of that famous household ever recorded by a person held in it. Asked whether she had been ill-treated, she said that she had not been. Asked why she ran, she said that she wanted to be free. Martha Washington never forgave her. She spoke of it as ingratitude. She was, on that subject, a woman without any imagination whatsoever, and it is the one place in this life where the door closes and there is nothing generous behind it. There was another, and you have already met him. Hercules the cook, walking out in the Philadelphia evenings with his cane, while the city looked at him. He had a wife who was a dower woman and 3 children by her. In 1797, on the president's 65th birthday, Hercules ran, leaving a daughter of 6 behind him at Mount Vernon. A French visitor asked the child whether she was not sad that she would never see her father again, and she is said to have answered that she was very glad, because he was free now. They hunted for Hercules too, for years, and never found him. He was living in New York under the name Hercules Posey. Washington's will freed him in 1801, and he may never have known it. He died in New York in 1812 and was buried in an African burying ground. That is the household. Both things are in it at once, and you cannot take one out. He had wanted to go at the end of the first term. She had wanted it more. He was talked out of it by Hamilton and Jefferson together, the only subject on which those 2 men ever agreed, and he served 4 more years and hated most of them. In September of 1796, he published a letter to the American people in a Philadelphia newspaper, saying that he would not stand again. He warned them against faction, against permanent alliances abroad, against the spirit of party that he had watched eat his own cabinet. He said that after 45 years of public service, with an increasing weight of years upon him, he needed the shade of retirement. And in a house in Philadelphia, a woman of 65, who had been keeping other people's houses since she was 19, understood that she was going home for good. The last months were an ordeal of dinners. Everybody wished to take leave. On the 4th of March, 1797, John Adams was sworn in, and Adams wrote to his own wife that the sight of Washington in the hall, serene, cheerful, plainly delighted, seemed to say, "Aye, I am fairly out, and you are fairly in. See which of us shall be happiest. And then they packed. It took days, and it took wagons. The furniture, the china, the birds in cages, a parrot and a dog for Nellie, and the enslaved household. And on the road home, the crowds came out one more time. They reached Mount Vernon on the 15th of March. The 8 years ended. He would not stand a third time a decision that mattered more than almost any he ever took. And in March of 1797, at the age of 65, George Washington watched John Adams sworn in and became a private man and went home. She had wanted this for 22 years. She wrote to a friend that the curtain was falling on their public life and that she looked forward to a more tranquil theatre. They found the house in a state of decay and the farms deranged and the roof leaking, and they were entirely happy. He wrote to a friend that he had begun his day, as he intended to continue it, with his coat off and a hammer in his hand. Painters were got in. The roof was mended. He rode out at first light, 5 farms, 30 miles, every day, and came back at 3 to whoever had arrived. Because they arrived. That is the thing about those last 2 years, and it wore her out. He was, by then, not a man but a monument, and the road from Alexandria brought a stream of people who wished to look at a monument and be given dinner by it. He wrote in exasperation to his mother's family that his house might as well be a well-resorted tavern. He calculated once that he and his wife had not sat down to dinner alone together in 20 years, and expressed a hope of doing it before they died. I do not believe they ever did. And there was one more alarm. In 1798, the country came to the edge of war with France, and John Adams, without asking, appointed Washington commander-in-chief of a provisional army, and the newspapers announced it. And the general at 66 accepted on conditions, and began corresponding about brigadiers. Imagine being his wife in that summer. She was 67. She had given the man to a war for 8 years, and to a government for 8 more, and had been told, twice, that it was over, and it was now beginning again. It did not begin. The crisis passed. The army was never embodied, and he never left home. Nellie grew up. She was clever and imperious and adored, and she had suitors from every good family on the Potomac, and refused them all, and then fell in love with Lawrence Lewis, Washington's own nephew, who had come to Mount Vernon to help receive the visitors. They were married in the front parlor on the 22nd of February in 1799, which was his 67th birthday. He wore his old Continental uniform for her, the blue and buff, and it was the last time in his life that he put it on. Nellie asked afterwards whether he had done it for the wedding or for the birthday, and he did not tell her. Washi, meanwhile, was expelled from one college and drifted out of another, and his grandfather wrote him letters of a controlled despair, and his grandmother forgave him everything, exactly as she had forgiven his father before him. In the last week of November, Nellie bore a daughter, and Martha Washington held the 4th generation of her family in her arms. The old man walked up and down the passage and was pleased with himself. 3 weeks later it was December, and the 12th of December, and it was snowing and sleeting and raining by turns, and a man of 67 rode out for 5 hours to see to his farms, because he always did, and came in with the snow still in his hair, and would not change his clothes before dinner. By the next morning he had a sore throat. He rode out again anyway, into the snow, to mark some trees he wanted felled. In the evening he sat in the parlour with his wife and with Tobias Lear, his secretary, and looked over the newspapers and spoke aloud from them in a voice that was going hoarse. And when Lear suggested he take something for the cold, he said what he always said, that he never took anything for a cold, and would let it go as it came. She went up to bed. He sat on, and came up later, and in the small hours of Saturday, the 14th of December, he woke her and told her he was very unwell. He could barely speak, and could not swallow. She wanted to get up and call somebody. He would not let her, because the fire was out, and the room was freezing, and he was afraid she would take cold herself. And so they lay there in the dark, the two of them, until Caroline came in at daybreak to lay the fire. Then the house woke, and the doctors came, and what followed was 400 years of medicine doing its worst. They bled him. The overseer bled him first, and she stood over the terrified man and told him not to take too much. Then Dr. Craik came, his oldest friend, and bled him again, and then twice more. Something over 100 ounces of blood was taken out of that body in a single day, more than half of everything he had, along with purges and blisters and a gargle that nearly choked him. He almost certainly had an infection of the epiglottis, which was swelling shut, and there was no treatment for it in the world in 1799, and everything they did made it faster. He knew before any of them. In the afternoon he had her bring him the 2 wills from his desk, and looked at them, and had her burn one and keep the other. He told the doctors to let him go quietly. He told Craik that he died hard, but that he was not afraid to go. He thanked them for their trouble, and begged them to trouble themselves no more. Towards 10 at night he could make himself understood again, and he told Lear that he was going, and that he wished to be decently buried and not put into the vault in less than 3 days, because he had a horror of being buried alive. Lear could not speak, and bowed instead. Washington looked at him and asked whether he understood him. Lear answered yes, and the old man said, "It is well." Those are his last words. In that room were his wife at the foot of the bed, and Lear, and the doctors, and the housekeeper, and Christopher Shields, his body servant, standing beside him, and 3 enslaved women, Caroline, Charlotte, and Molly, at the door. Somewhere before 11 he put his own hand to his own wrist to feel his pulse, and his hand fell away. Lear looked up. From the foot of the bed she asked, "Is he gone?" Lear could not say it and made a sign, and Martha Washington said quite steadily, "It is well. All is now over. I shall soon follow him. I have no more trials to pass through." She was 68, and she had been married to him for 40 years and 11 months. She did not attend the funeral. She heard it from an upstairs window, the horse led behind the coffin with his boots reversed in the stirrups, the schooner in the river firing minute guns, the Masonic Brethren, the militia, the long procession down the slope to the old vault. Bells rang in cities she had never seen. In the Congress a Virginian pronounced him first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. And the phrase went around the world. The country went into a mourning that had no precedent, because no country had ever lost a man in that particular position before. Congress adjourned and put on black. Every ship in every harbour flew its colours at half-mast. In hundreds of towns the people staged a funeral of their own, with an empty bier and a riderless horse and a procession through the streets. And in the churches the ministers preached for weeks. Men wore crape on the left arm for 6 months. Mourning rings were made, and lockets with a thread of his hair, and printers sold engravings of him ascending into the clouds. In Paris, Bonaparte ordered 10 days of mourning for the armies of France. In London, the Channel Fleet lowered its flags for a man who had beaten it. None of that reached the 3rd floor of the house above the Potomac. And then she closed the door of the bedchamber they had shared for 40 years, and never opened it again, and went up to the 3rd floor and moved into a garret. I have stood in that garret in my mind 100 times. It is under the roof. There is a dormer window. It is small and plain, and it has none of the elegance of the floors below it, and from it you cannot see the tomb, which I suspect was the point. She had a bed, a chair, a fire, a work-basket, her Bible. She was still the mistress of the estate. Her husband's whole property was hers for life, and 153 people on it still depended on decisions made under that roof, whatever she believed about the nature of that dependence. But she handed the running of it to her nephews and to Lear, and did not want it. The rhythm of those 2.5 years was very plain. She rose early, as she had always risen. She had her hour alone with her Bible. She came down and saw the household ordered. Then she sat with her work-basket and sewed and knitted, and Nellie's babies were brought to her, and she answered the letters, hundreds of them, because the whole nation wrote to her, in her own hand for as long as she could hold the pen. The Congress wrote among them to ask whether her husband's body might be moved to the new federal city and laid under the Capitol, and she gave her consent, though it broke her, because he had wished to lie at home, and she thought a widow ought not to refuse a nation. In the event they never did it, and he stayed on the hill above the river. Visitors still came, because they always came, and she received them, because she always had. A woman who saw her in 1801 wrote that Mrs. Washington spoke of her own death as though it were a pleasant journey she was shortly to make, and that there was nothing morbid in the way she said it, only a kind of settled expectation, as though she had already packed. There were two more things to do, and she did them both. The first was the will. In it, her husband had freed the 123 human beings he owned outright, not at once, but upon her death, because so many of the enslaved families at Mount Vernon were husbands and wives across the two estates. His people married to her dour people, and to liberate his at once would have split every one of those families down the middle. He understood that. He said so. He was the only one of the great Virginia slaveholders of the founding generation to release his people at all, and he could not bring himself to do it while he lived, and he made his wife's death the price of their liberty. Think about what that did to the house. There were more than 300 people at Mount Vernon, and 123 of them now understood that they would be free on the day the old woman upstairs stopped breathing. She understood it too. In the winter of 1800 there was a fire at Mount Vernon, of uncertain origin. Her relatives urged her, and Abigail Adams heard it from her own lips. She was not easy in that house. On the 15th of December, in 1800, Martha Washington signed a deed of manumission, filed in the county court, freeing her husband's slaves early. They walked out free on the first day of January, 1801. I am not going to dress that up as a change of heart, because it was not one. She freed them because she was afraid, and because her advisers told her to, and there is no letter anywhere in which she says she thought slavery wrong. And it is still true that on the first morning of a new century, 123 people at Mount Vernon woke up belonging to themselves, some of them staying on for wages because their wives and husbands could not leave, some of them walking down the lane and out of the record forever. His will had gone further than the bare word freedom, and it is the one place where you can watch a Virginian of that generation actually think the problem through. The old and the infirm among his people were to be clothed and fed by his estate for the whole of their lives. Children with no parents, or whose parents could not provide for them, were to be taught to write and to figure and bound out to a trade, and freed at 25. He forbade, in the plainest language he ever used about anything, the sale of any of them, or the transportation of any of them out of Virginia, under any pretext whatsoever. And he directed that the whole of it be executed religiously, and he underlined the word. Some of the freed people walked away that January and were never traced. Some stayed on at Mount Vernon and worked for wages, because their wives or their husbands or their children were dour people and could not leave. And freedom that meant leaving your family behind is a thing you may or may not accept. The estate paid pensions to the old ones for decades, and was still paying them in the 1830s, 30 years after the general was in his tomb. The 153 dour people could not be freed by anybody. Not by her, not by him. They belonged, in the law's cold fiction, to the estate of a man who had died intestate in 1757. Ona Judge was legally one of them, and so were her children in New Hampshire, sitting in a cottage they had made for themselves and owning none of it. What waited for all of them on the day the old woman died was written into the law already, and I will come to it. And it is the reason the word dower has sat in the middle of this whole evening like a stone. She knew that too. She left them where they were. It is the last and hardest fact in this life, and I will not take it out. The second thing she did was in the spring of 1802, when she fell ill with a fever and knew what it was. She made her will and signed it. In it she left the estate to her grandchildren, and mourning rings to her friends, and to her grandson Washi she left one enslaved man, named Elish, whom she owned outright and could have freed with a stroke of the pen, and did not. I set that down beside the deed of manumission she had signed 16 months earlier, and I let the two of them stand together, because they belong together, and because a life is not a verdict. Then she made ready to die, the way she had made ready for everything, in order and without fuss. She chose the clothes she was to be buried in and laid them out. She sent for a clergyman and took communion. She called the family to the garret and spoke to them, one at a time, and told the young ones to live as they had been taught. And then she asked for the letters, 40 years of them. Everything he had written to her from Cambridge and Valley Forge and Newburgh and New York and Philadelphia, everything she had written to him and he had kept. the private voice of the most public man on earth, and hers alongside it. But the one thing she still owned that the country wanted, she fed them into the fire in that upstairs room, sheet by sheet, until they were gone. 2 survived, because they were in a drawer of a writing desk, and nobody found them until her granddaughter opened it years afterwards. One of them is the letter from Philadelphia in June of 1775, in which a man of 43 tells his wife that he has been given command of an army, and that he could not refuse it without dishonor, and that his only real distress is the thought of her being uneasy, and that his affection for her is unalterable. People have called the burning a tragedy for history, and so it is. Historians have never stopped mourning it, but she was not history's servant. She had spent 43 years being looked at, and interpreted and printed in the newspapers, and named on ships and taverns and porcelain. That correspondence was the last room in the house that had a door. She shut it on the 22nd of May in 1802 in the garret at Mount Vernon. Martha Dandridge Custis Washington died. She was 70. Nellie was with her. They carried her down the slope and laid her beside him. What became of them all? Nellie Custis Lewis lived until 1852 and had 8 children and buried most of them, and spent her long widowhood answering letters from strangers who wanted to know what her grandfather had been like at breakfast. Washie Custis grew up and built a great columned mansion on a hill across the river from the new federal city, and filled it with his grandfather's relics, and made a career of being the adopted son of George Washington. He had one surviving daughter. She married an army officer named Lee, and the place on the hill was called Arlington. And what happened to it afterwards is not tonight's story. The 153 Dower people were divided among the 4 Custis grandchildren in 1802, as the law required and as everybody had always known would happen. It took a year. Families that had been made at Mount Vernon over 3 generations, the marriages across the farms, the children, the grandmothers, were separated and carried off to 4 different estates in 4 directions. Christopher Shields, who had stood at the bedside when the general died, was among them. So was Ona Judge's mother, Betty, and so, in the eyes of the law, was Ona Judge herself and her children, sitting free in New Hampshire and never legally free at all. Ona Judge Staines outlived every single person in this story. She died in Greenland, New Hampshire, in 1848 at about 75. She had been poor for 50 years. She had learned her letters as an adult and taught herself to write, and she had chosen her own church, and she had never for one moment considered going back. When a newspaper man asked her, near the end, whether she regretted running away into hardship from a comfortable house, she said no, because she was free, and because in New Hampshire she had learned to worship the God she chose. Hercules Posey, who had walked those Philadelphia streets in his black coat, lived out his freedom in New York, and for almost 2 centuries afterwards, nobody knew even that much. Mount Vernon fell into ruin. Washie could not keep it, and the nephew who inherited it could not, and by the middle of the next century the roof was falling in, and the piazza was propped with ships' masts, and the family were trying to sell it to anybody, the state, the federal government, and nobody would buy. It was saved by a woman, a semi-invalid from South Carolina named Anne Pamela Cunningham, who founded an association of women in every state, and raised the money by subscription, and bought the house in 1858, and holds it still. There is a certain justice in that. A house built and kept by women's work was preserved, in the end, by a national association of women, when every man with the power to save it declined. And in 1831 they opened the old vault and moved the 2 of them up the slope to the new one, into marble sarcophagi, side by side, where they lie now with the Potomac below. 80 years after her death, a woman's face appeared on the front of a United States banknote, and it was hers, and it has never been anybody else's since. And here is what I would like you to take with you as the room goes quiet. The country she is remembered for did not exist when she was born, and she never asked for it, and she never wanted the position it gave her. Everything she is famous for, she did reluctantly and did well. She was not an intellectual, and she never pretended to be one. She was not a rebel. On the largest moral question of her age, she was simply, comfortably, and terribly wrong, and I have not hidden it from you. But when a poor young officer sat across a tea table from her and had nothing to offer but his character, she judged it correctly, and that judgment altered the shape of the world. When her husband was starving on a hillside with 2,000 of his men dying around him, she got into a coach in the middle of winter and went to him, and she did it 8 times. And she never once wrote a line suggesting that she thought this remarkable. When the fighting stopped and she wanted her life back, she was asked to invent a role no woman had ever held, in a country that had not decided whether it wanted her to be a queen or a farmer's wife. And she performed it for 8 years with such tact that we have all forgotten it required any skill at all. She buried 4 children and 2 husbands. She kept the keys. That is what a life looked like for a woman. In the 18th century, enormous consequence, almost no authority, and a fire at the end into which she put the only private thing she had. Let your mind go back up the river one last time, and let it be summer. The tobacco is standing in the fields at Chestnut Grove. The chestnut trees are heavy. There is a house with a passage running through the middle of it so that the air can move, and somewhere inside, a girl of 9 or 10 is being taught how much meal a household eats in a week, and how to be pleasant to a guest she cannot bear. She does not know that she is going to be carried down the river to a great house, and up 100 miles of bad road to a hill above the Potomac, and north through the snow to an army 8 times over. She does not know that she will hold a nation's first office of hospitality and count the days until it ends. She does not know about the 4 small coffins, or the letters, or the fire. She is only the eldest daughter, taking the keys. The lamps in the hall are being lit now, and the house is settling for the night, and the river outside is going the color of pewter, and there is nothing left for anybody to do until morning. If these evenings are something you would like to find again, you are always welcome to subscribe. And if you enjoyed this evening together, a comment telling me where you were listening from means more than you know. I look through all of them. Sleep well, stay warm, be kind to the people in your house, and I will see you in the next one. Good night.